のページ読まなくちゃいけない気になるよ
Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack
and Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, we are reviewing the 4,000th Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but you don't know either.
It is the 29th. I have the Wikipedia page open. It is the 29th. We're almost at 30.
Oh my god. Anyway, it is Thor, Love and Thunder, the fourth Thor movie, the second by Taika Waititi. We will be reviewing that on the show today. I actually haven't talked to you about this yet, Sean. Spoiler-free thoughts, what'd you think?
Disappointing. It's not particularly good. Like, it's not the worst Marvel movie necessarily, but it's one where you can see a like Thor Ragnarok level movie buried somewhere in there. But there are like a lot of very fundamental issues with it that it kind of constantly trips over throughout the whole film.
I said this on Twitter, and I think it's the right way to describe it. It is a really rough first draft of a good movie. Like, I can see how you could... it's like if a student handed me a paper, and I'm like, oh, this isn't hopeless. I could help you turn this into something better. But it's not there yet. That's this movie, I think.
Yes, it's either that, or I wonder how much of there was maybe a better version of this movie in production at some point that then got fucked with. Is it, like, it's either a first draft or it got like reshot and like stuff got cut out and it got changed along the way. It is one of those two, because it is definitely, you can see all the ideas there, but there are clearly, like, there are things have happened that have prevented those ideas from kind of culminating ultimately in the final movie.
Yeah, it's definitely a disappointment, but I'm looking forward to talking about it and waiting for... Sean, basically, I just need you to explain to me what the fuck a god is in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because we went back and forth about this on Twitter the other day, and you assured me they were just aliens.
They're just aliens. Nothing about this changes that. They're
who are
aliens.
Immortal and have their own heaven and all of this other stuff. Like,
yeah, magic exists. They're magical aliens, but they're still fundamentally aliens.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that later. In any case, other stuff to get to on the show as well. We'll talk about a little bit of news, including the passing of Yu-Gi-Oh! Author Kazuki Takahashi, who I want to pay some tribute to, and we will talk about that later on the show. Before we get into stuff and everything, Sean, a little bit of housekeeping. We announced on last week's show, which was an episode of Weekly Suit Gundam, that we are evolving the Weekly Suit Gundam project into yet another new podcast that we are calling Japanimation Station. Do you want to tell the kids what that's about really quick, in case they missed that announcement?
Yeah, so if people listen to the Weekly Stuff but have not been following the Weekly Suit Gundam stuff, we have basically reached the end of the road of Weekly Suit Gundam, in the sense of, other than new stuff that has like just released or is on the horizon, there's not more Gundam really for us to cover. But we wanted to keep the Weekly Suit Gundam train going in some form. And so that form is becoming Japanimation Station. So it's basically, Japanimation Station is going to be an anime-focused podcast that is open to basically any anime style topic, and it'll still be focused around like big picture topics. So we'll be picking things like going through all of the, like, Tomino's filmography as a director basically is going to be one of the first really, really big topics we do. So it's still going to have a lot of the Weekly Suit Gundam format and DNA and structure in there, but just opened up to a wider base of topics. So if there are people who aren't into the Gundam side of stuff, but like listening to us talk about anime, that is what Japanimation Station is going to be all the way through, and I'm super excited about it.
I'm super excited about it too. We're going to be kicking it off with a series of episodes about Full Metal Alchemist, because if you're a Weekly Stuff listener, you know Sean read that manga recently, which made me very excited to finally get him to watch the anime and have someone to talk about the 2003 anime with 20 years later. And someone who is the complete reverse of the rest of the world, who read the manga first and then saw the 2003 anime and is going to have some culture shock. It's going to be great.
Yes, I'm very excited. I'm going to start watching that soon, I think, in order to have enough build up to us being able to record that episode as soon as we can.
Yeah, I just started watching it the other night. Pulled out my old single DVDs, because back in the day, people, we bought anime 3 to 4 episodes at a time on DVD or VHS, and it's a trip.
I'm impressed that you have kept them.
They're great. Like, I think people will... I mean, this will be part of our thesis when we get to Full Metal Alchemist, but, like, I think Full Metal Alchemist 2003 for a whole generation of people is kind of what Cowboy Bebop was a few years earlier for slightly older anime fans, in that it was this kind of like limited anime show that came out that was different than your ongoing Yu-Gi-Ohs and Dragon Balls and the ones that go on forever, right? And told a story, was really cool, was really dramatic, like reached for the stars, made you realize, oh, anime is capable of more than what I'm seeing on American TV. And that was that show. And so the Funimation like singles were like super like nice releases with booklets and art and all sorts of cool stuff. So I've kept them because they're just fantastic like anime releases.
That's good, because most of like my old anime DVDs are utter shit. Like they're terrible. Like the ones that have like the here's 3 episodes of fucking Dragon Ball or something on a DVD.
Those were bad, yeah.
Like a lot of that stuff was just like, a lot of that was like the anime boom was kind of starting to come to an end, and they're just like shitting out awful products. And most of that stuff I care about. I have upgraded in my home video collection since to like Blu-ray versions and stuff. Yeah,
Full Metal Alchemist did eventually have. I mean, it's a standard definition production, so it like a Blu-ray would be kind of misleading. It would be a standard def upscale. But anyway, that's going to be Japanimation Station. It's going to be the Weekly Suit Gundam YouTube channel is going to be turning into Japanimation Station, and Weekly Suit Gundam will continue every so often as a show on that channel, but it'll be Japanimation Station, and then there will be a new podcast feed for the show Japanimation Station. I will also, of course, the first episodes of that will go in this feed, they'll go in the Weekly Suit Gundam feed. You'll be well aware before it happens, and it is easy to find new podcasts because they go everywhere now. They go to Spotify, they go to Google Play, they go to Apple Podcasts. Amazon has a podcast thing now I had to learn about. It's everywhere.
I'm sure that some fucking feed will get updated, and like someone will have like their toaster will automatically download our podcast. It's just it's the world we live in now.
I mean, honestly, a refrigerator that plays podcasts wouldn't be the worst product in the world while you're like cooking or something. Get on that. Whoever I say get on that, I'm sure that exists.
Yes, there has got to be a refrigerator. I mean, I know that refrigerators can hook up to the internet because you can get fridge apps for modern refrigerators. So putting a speaker in that thing is not too far from that.
Indeed. All right, Sean, that's Japanimation Station, and we should say that will be launching with its first episode on August 1st is the plan for that. So look for that August 1st. In terms of stuff, what have you been up to, Sean?
Jonathan, I've got a fever, and the only cure is Resident Evil.
So you're in the place I was a couple years ago, like during the pandemic when I went Resident Evil crazy?
Yes, because it is the kind of game series that does that. They are very addictive to play. So I think I teased a little bit on last week's episode at the very end or I guess at the very beginning, because we recorded the weekly stuff section at the very end of our recording session last week. But anyways, I said kind of where I was in my Resident Evil stuff, but just to like recap my total progress over the course of, I think this has been like 3.5 weeks at this point, has been I have played the Jill playthrough of Resident Evil Remake, the original Resident Evil Remake. I've done the Chris playthrough of Resident Evil Remake. I have done the Leon playthrough of Resident Evil Remake 2. I've done the Claire playthrough of Resident Evil Remake 2. And I have played through all of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and I am about halfway through Resident Evil 4. So I am deep in the shit with Resident Evil. And if you want to play Resident Evil games on PlayStation, PSN just had a big sale, and I think it is still ongoing, that has all the Resident Evil stuff is at least 60% off. So now my entire bar, like on my PlayStation 5, is Resident Evil games and Genshin Impact, because I filled it up because I looked at it. It was like it was so cheap. I was like, I might as well buy Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. I would be dumb not to at this low price. I don't know if I'm going to play Resident Evil 5 or 6. I've played Resident Evil 5 before.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I did that on an Xbox sale. I have them all on Xbox, but I did the exact same thing, and I have all of them there.
Yeah. So I got those. I got Code Veronica, which was like the thing I had in my wish list, and was waiting to go on sale. That's where I got the notification for it. So I have Code Veronica now. I already had Resident Evil 0, and then I bought the Resident Evil Revelations games that I heard are not like amazing, but are pretty good.
Those ones I've actually never played. I should take a look at those.
Yeah, they seem pretty interesting. They were like episodic releases, but obviously you buy it now. That's just you get like the whole kit and caboodle. But yeah, so now I'm totally tricked out. I obviously already had Resident Evil 7 and 8, and I do have the original Resident Evil 2 and the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis for the GameCube. So I can play those at some point here on actual hardware, I guess.
Again, amazing that you have those. I'm
Yes.
very jealous.
So yeah, I'm totally tricked out in Resident Evil. And I guess like the games I haven't really talked about are 2 and 3 Remake, which are both great games. Obviously 2 is like the better one because 3 feels, I think everybody knows kind of the deal with 3, that it was originally designed as a smaller project that then got kind of turned into Resident Evil 3, kind of mid-production. That's the original version. And so the remake reflects a lot of that design stuff. So the remake also feels like it is like a big expansion pack or something for Resident Evil 2 Remake. But if you go into it kind of knowing that that's what it is, and also if you didn't pay full price for it, which I didn't, like I really enjoyed Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil 2 Remake a lot, and kind of look at them as almost like one big package in a weird way, because it's all a story about the same events, right? It's all the invasion of Raccoon City. It's all the same basic style of game. And so I feel like if you're playing these remakes, it's kind of like, if you're playing them now after both of them are released, it almost feels like they should have been both put into the same launcher or something and have Resident Evil 3 be a separate campaign of Resident Evil 2 or something like that.
Yeah, no, Resident Evil 3 totally feels like especially the remake feels like DLC for 2, but not in a bad way. I did pay full price for it because I was just having Resident Evil fever at the time, and I still had a great time. It's a damn good little game. Not as, again, it's the weirdness of the actual Resident Evil 3 is Code Veronica, and 3 has always been like a weird offshoot of 2, and then 4 is like the next, big step after that, but it's still worth playing, especially if they're on sale, and they're so much fun.
Yeah, and Resident Evil 2 Remake, and then 3 by extension, like that style is very interesting, because they find, I think, a pretty fascinating midpoint between kind of like a modern like version of 4 or something, right? Because it's the third person shooter stuff, but it kind of like, for the third person shooters, like you are so kind of inaccurate, or your aiming is so kind of wonky in a very intentional way. It's not Gears of War and Uncharted or anything where you're like shooting exactly in the middle every time. Like they build in mechanics to the third person shooting in 3 Remake to make it so that it's not just an action game necessarily, but it's obviously much more actiony than a classic Resident Evil is. And I think it's like a very fascinating midpoint where you feel a lot of the sort of core design philosophy behind the classic style Resident Evil games, while like making it very much a much more modern game that is more accessible to modern players and their kind of sensibilities. Because while I love, and I know that you love, the classic Resident Evil style, know that like for most modern people playing games, it is like a very archaic structure and control system and stuff like that, and it's like a big ask. You have to kind of relearn how to play games in certain ways if you want to do the truly classic Resident Evil style. And so I think it's like a very good compromise in terms of design that these new remakes do in preserving a lot of that sensibility of the old games while still making it something that new players can enjoy, and getting like something that feels like more actiony and more direct is pretty fun. Particularly 3, which is very actiony, because 3 is basically like, Resident Evil has its 2 modes. It's got survival horror mode, and it's got like action movie mode, and it kind of, this franchise vacillates between those, and it's kind of like a spectrum it exists on. And Resident Evil 3 is very hard in this is like action movie Resident Evil, which I'm way into. Resident Evil 4 is also action movie Resident Evil, and I'm way into that. I also like the more survival horror-y stuff that Resident Evil 2 Remake has.
Yeah. Resident Evil 2 Remake also has Mr. X.
Yes.
We love Mr. X. That's fucking fantastic deployment of that whole idea in that game. Yeah.
I will say, I think on the second playthrough, Mr. X wore out his welcome a little bit to me. I think it became a little bit tedious on the second playthrough, just because it's like, I know where everything is, and I know how to get around this, and I know how to do this, and it's just like him popping up out of nowhere just adds unnecessary time to my like speeding through the game. Because Resident Evil has always been designed as a you play it multiple times kind of franchise, partially as a like to get the best time and to sort of solve the design puzzle box of the Resident Evil areas in the classic style, where, you know, like the Resident Evil 1 mansion is this big kind of puzzle box area where there, you know, you have to get different keys and items to access different areas that give you different other keys and items, and you're slowly kind of unlocking all the aspects of the full area, and that's kind of the fundamental way that they were designed. And I think that is a fun thing to, on replays, find the ways to make that as efficient as possible. So like when I did my Chris playthrough of Resident Evil 1 Remake, I think I shaved off about 4 to 5 hours of my total playtime just because I knew where everything was.
Right.
And it was about being as efficient as possible. And that's kind of the mindset I went in with the Claire playthrough, because I started with Leon in Resident Evil 2. And like the Mr. X stuff, I think in that context is a little bit annoying. But in the main playthrough, it's really great. Like it definitely is exciting and adds more mystery to the design and like unexpected kind of emergent elements to encounters. But I kind of wish that because they introduced him earlier in the second playthrough mode, and I kind of wish they didn't do that. I wish that they restricted him to the same kind of amount he was in the original playthrough, and not kind of bring him in earlier when you do the second playthrough version of the game.
No, that's totally fair. I just will never forget, like, the moment you meet him the first time with the fire and the helicopter, and like I shot his hat off and got an achievement. It's such good stuff.
Yes.
But
it's goofy in that Resident Evil way you want, right? Like, here's this big tyrant dude who is just wearing a like 1950s reporter like trench coat and big fedora hat, and you're like, where did they go? Like, I don't know what like specialty clothes store they went to get this like tailored coat and hat for this. Like, you know, you definitely have like you know, clothes stores for bigger people. But this guy's like 10 feet tall. You know, this is like outside the realm of like big and tall or something like that.
You know, they have a whole specialty fashion department at Umbrella just to like dress their crazy creations. But yes, now you're on Resident Evil 4. Do you still want to do a Resident Evil 4 episode in a couple weeks?
Yes. Yeah.
We need to do that.
I'm well on track to be finishing my replay of Resident Evil 4 well before we'll have time to do the podcast for it. So, yes, I'm excited for that. That's kind of like what we're pinning for a future topic in the near future. And yeah, one of the weird sort of side effects of Resident Evil 2 Remake being sort of the third-person style and, like, you know, over the shoulder and all that, and kind of having some of that Resident Evil 4 influence, and you're playing as Leon, is about halfway through my Leon playthrough, and I remember telling you this off the air, I think, last week, Jonathan, is I just, like, had this urge of, oh my god, I have got to play Resident Evil 4 right fucking now. There's just a moment where it's like, I'm Leon, I'm headshotting a zombie with a shotgun over the third person. It was just like I had like a flash to playing Resident Evil 4 on like the 360 version is the original version that I played in like 2008 or 2009, whenever that came out. And I just was like, I have got to play Resident Evil 4 right now. And again, I'm about halfway through playing it this time, and that game is perfect. It's just one of the best games ever made. And it is as good as I remembered it being, and that is very satisfying a feeling.
Yeah, so we'll do a Resident Evil 4 episode. I think, you know, both because we've always wanted to do it, and then also because there's this remake coming out next year, and it'll be a good setup for the Resident Evil 4 remake. But then also maybe we can bring in some of these other Resident Evil topics and talk about it all a little bit more on a future episode.
Yeah, I'll say doing the remake stuff, like, you know, we've talked before about how, like, Resident Evil 4 remake conceptually doesn't feel particularly necessary. But, like, playing it with this, the one I actually want is them to just do Resident Evil 1 in that style. You know, Resident Evil 1 Remake, as it exists currently, is already a kind of perfect game, but it is that style of game. It's not a third-person over-the-shoulder thing, which Resident Evil 4 already is. And I would actually be way into being able to explore that mansion and some of those areas with that level of visual detail from that different perspective, because I think it would feel more valuable, a different kind of game, than doing that with Resident Evil 4. You know, obviously we'll see what the Resident Evil 4 remake actually is. Maybe they'll do like really fascinating stuff with it. But right now, conceptually, I kind of wish that they went in the other direction and did a Resident Evil 1 remake. Also, so that if people who haven't played either original Resident Evil or the original version of the Resident Evil remake, and you just started with 2 remake and 3 remake, you have no idea who the fuck Jill Valentine is, because
right.
You know, so in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, they don't actually set up her character in any way, which I was kind of surprised by, because there isn't a like updated, super modern version of Resident Evil 1 that is in that style. So I kind of wish that they went in the other direction, because it would be cool to see that game from that perspective, and it would be able to coexist with original Resident Evil remake perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a Code Veronica remake. I think, frankly, Resident Evil 6 Apology Edition, where they just make a good game called Resident Evil 6. Literally anything would be more interesting to me than a Resident Evil 4 remake, but we'll see when they get around to it.
Yeah.
So I've been playing a newer video game, Sean. I have been playing Triangle Strategy on Nintendo Switch. I alluded to this a couple of weeks ago, but I finally dived in. This is a game I've really been wanting to play. If you don't remember what this is the Square Enix tactical RPG from the team that did Octopath Traveler in the same visual style, which they call HD 2D, which means nothing. But the visual style itself is really cool. I like the style. It's really more 3D 2D, but I guess they didn't call it that.
We don't call things 2.5D anymore like we did in 2009.
Yes.
So that's it feels like that's what they want to call it, but we can't call it that anymore.
I mean, it really is more 2.5D because it's 3D. It's an Unreal Engine 4 process with 3D models with 2D pixel art over them and then actual 2D sprites. So it is kind of a 2.5D thing. But anyway, it's a beautiful visual style. Triangle Strategy is the sort of follow-up from Octopath Traveler. Very different game. Octopath Traveler was a sort of traditional JRPG exploration, dungeons, turn-based combat with a slightly more, sort of gimmicky setup in that it was 8 stories that intersect in all these ways. And I really loved Octopath Traveler. I talked about that at the time. I think that's a great game. And Triangle Strategy is more in an homage to Final Fantasy Tactics specifically. But after playing a bunch of it, and I'm about 20 hours in, I'm about halfway through the game. I think it has 20 chapters, and I'm on chapter 10. And I am loving this game so far. I think it's fantastic, but I think it's fantastic in very specific ways that you should know about going in, because I think there's probably a lot of people who play Nintendo games and their experience with tactical RPGs is Fire Emblem. Mm-hmm. And this has, if you like Fire Emblem, there's a good chance you'll like Triangle Strategy, but it is fairly different. The easiest, comparison is to Final Fantasy Tactics, but if you haven't played that, I would describe what Triangle Strategy is doing, and this is not a put down of Fire Emblem, I'm just trying to phrase it a certain way. It's kind of Fire Emblem for adults. It's not that Fire Emblem is for little kids, but Fire Emblem has a little bit more of a kind of cartoony high fantasy vibe in that it is high fantasy, but it's high fantasy about, dragons and magic and all this sort of stuff, right? And the battles can be very intense, but what Triangle Strategy is doing is just there's another couple of layers of things going on with it. So it's a tactical RPG with a grid and a turn system and all of that, but there is also, and this is something they pull from Final Fantasy Tactics, there is also height and elevation you have to take into account, because it is a 3D map, and so you're above or below opponents. You have to consider your positionality, because if someone attacks you or you attack them from the back, you get a critical hit. So there's all these sort of extra things going on. It is easier than Fire Emblem in one way, in that it does not have permadeath, although Fire Emblem, you don't have to have permadeath anymore anyway. Mm-hmm. And frankly, a lot of the recent Fire Emblem games have been written in such a way that it feels like they shouldn't have permadeath, because no one can actually die in Fire Emblem Three Houses, because you have to have them in the story. So permadeath, it's perma-retire is how it is in the modern Fire Emblem games, which disappoints me a little bit in those games. Anyway, so Triangle Strategy, that's one side of it, is that I think the battles, I'm playing on hard mode at least, and on hard mode I think they're just a touch more demanding than sort of your, sort of typical starting difficulty in Fire Emblem, because there's just a couple more things you have to keep in mind, and there's a lot going on. It also is doing sort of an old school Fire Emblem thing in that there are not a bunch of battles in between the battles. It's each chapter is one major battle. There are a couple of imaginary training battles you can do in your encampment, but it's not quite the same as a Fire Emblem Three Houses or Awakening, where there's a map and there's lots of options to go do grinding. It's mainly just the main series of battles. And then there is a big story component, and the story component is also quite a bit more mature than you would typically get from this genre. And I say mature specifically in the sense that Triangle Strategy is a high fantasy story in that it is a fictional world, medieval style kingdom. There is magic in the sense that there are characters who can use magic on the battlefield and cast fire and healing and all of that. And other than that, there are basically no fantasy elements to speak of whatsoever. It is the most down-to-earth fantasy story I've basically ever seen, in that this is a game about the trade of salt and iron between 3 neighboring kingdoms who share a continent, and it is about the sort of dry politicking between them to the degree that, like, it's a pretty significant way into the game before there is an inciting violent incident that kicks a major plot into gear. So much of the early part of this game is just learning about the world, learning about its history, learning about these kingdoms, learning about, like I said, the literal, like, there are characters who are, like, the main starting point of the plot is that these 3 kingdoms have come together and are opening a joint mine to mine iron, and there's one house that you play as. You are one of the, like, retainers of the King of Glenbrook. You are House Wolfort, and House Wolfort is helping to oversee this mine where there's a member of another royal family who is coming to help oversee the mining operations, and you're just helping to, like, coordinate between all of them. And then there's some political intrigue that comes out of that. But it is about, like, the very real world, like, politics that come into play in, like, not ancient history, but, like, you know, medieval and modern history of, you know, resource management, and refugee resettlement is a huge part of this game. Like, the way, like, caste systems happen in societies, and, like, racial castes in particular are a major theme, because the main character is the son of House Wolfort, who is pledged to be married to a woman who is a, like a bastard daughter of this other king who is part of this, like, lower racial caste. There's just so much, like, in the weeds on this that, for me, I think it makes for a really rich story, because it feels like a really, like, real world they've put together that is, like, deeply thought through. You can collect books and read about the history within the game, and those are fascinating to me, because it feels so much like you're just reading actual history from an alternate world, and all of that is really fun to see. And so the main, like, crux, thrust of the game is plot stuff. Like, the best way to describe this game, I think, is that it's kind of a visual novel with a tactical RPG on the side. It leans more towards story than it does towards gameplay, and when this game came out, I saw that definitely throw a lot of reviewers for a loop. There is a lot of story in this game, and most of the time is probably going to be spent sort of, like, watching and reading things. Like, the best recent game I could compare it to, honestly, might be something like 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Not in all of the crazy shit that game does with, like, interconnecting timelines and all of that, but just in the sense that that is a visual novel, in that it is, you know, mostly interacting and talking, and then there are some parts where you're walking around and exploring and getting keywords and stuff like that. There's some of that same kind of stuff in Triangle Strategy, and then there are periodic parts where you do these, you know, in that game it's sort of a, what would you call it? It's not quite a tactical RPG. It's a real-time strategy game.
It's like a real-time tactics kind of thing, yeah.
Right. And what is in Triangle Strategy is much more in-depth than the real-time strategy in Aegis Rim, but I think there is kind of a similar sort of division of story versus gameplay. There is gameplay stuff in the story. One really cool idea is that this game has a lot of branching narrative paths, and what they do for that is that your character, as the head of House Wolfort, has all of his, like, advisor characters who are your party, and the way they choose to make decisions in this, you know, like, kingdom is they get their main advisors together and they have the scale, I forget what they're called, like the scales of destiny or something, but they, like, have this big debate where you are deciding between one of 2 paths, and everyone, like, makes a vote on the scales, and it's like a communal decision, but you can talk to all of the characters and try to, like, nudge them one way or another, but you yourself don't get a vote. And I think that whole side of the gameplay is really fun. It leads to some actual, like, really interesting decisions where it's not 100% clear what's right and wrong, and makes me excited to play the game again someday and see other sides of the story. And I love it all. I think it's a really rich narrative. It feels like reading a good book. Like, it starts very slow in a very novelistic fashion. Not bad slow to me, just slow in the sense that there's a lot to introduce and set up. Another point of comparison might be early Game of Thrones. It's even drier than early Game of Thrones, because there's not something as, like, quote-unquote sexy as, like, incest twins throwing a little boy out of a roof or something like that. There's not dragons or anything like that, but there is this, you know, Game of Thrones starts with this, you know, house that is a retainer of the king, dealing with, like, political intrigue between these other major houses, and that's kind of what this game is doing as well. And then the tactical stuff is just fantastic. Like, when you are playing that, it, like, all of the maps so far do a really good job at, like, coming up with a cool central idea that is really challenging and this is what I like in a tactical game. I like getting through a match in a tactical RPG where I feel like I barely pulled it out. That's like the kind of fun way to do these, and I think this game does it beautifully. I love the graphics. I think it'll be a little bit of a lift for some people because all of it is told in this HD 2D pixel art style. I think one little thing they should have done is that in all of the story and dialogue scenes, they don't have like an animated portrait of the character on screen while they're talking. So it's the speech bubble, the voice actor, and I'll talk about the voice acting in a second because it's crazy. And then it is just their pixel art, and that can feel a little dry in some scenes where I think in a like Persona style where you have like a character portrait up that could help. You can bring up a character portrait at any point. If while someone's talking, you can press X and it brings up a big bio of them with like the full like illustrated character art, an explanation of who they are, what house they belong to, which is very helpful in the early going because it helps you know who's who and how do they interrelate. But it's not up by default. The voice acting, though, I assume in English is terrible because it's a Square Enix game. And I don't know why reviewers still review Square Enix games in English, like cut bait and go to the Japanese. Because the Japanese voice acting in Triangle Strategy is tremendous. The main two characters are voiced by Ono Kensho and Nakamura Yuichi. Like, that's the kind of, like, talent they have for it. And there's a ton of other great actors in it. And so it's basically like having a really good medieval history novel read to you by those actors with some cool pixel art. And then you get to play a cool tactics game. If that's something that it sounds like you would like, I think you will like this game. It also has a really great musical score by Akira Senju, who did Victory Gundam, who did Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Just a great, great score. Definitely a lot of the recent Square Enix JRPGs, Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler and this, have all had really special music by a variety of composers. And this is no different than that. There is a very full demo on Switch that lets you play basically the first 5 hours uninterrupted, nothing cut, and then you can carry your progress over. That is actually how I started to make sure I would like the game. You can play it in English or Japanese, any of that, so get the demo at least. I really like this game, and I think I understand why it had some tepid reception from American critics, but I think some of that is like a little bit of a failure of framing, and also I do imagine if you were listening to this with the dub, it would probably just like burn your ears off. But, you know, don't do that. It's a Square game. It's your madness.
Yeah, like one of the few things I knew about this game was that Nakamura Yuichi played one of the main characters, because the only footage of this game I have seen is that they did a video on a YouTube channel he's on called Washiagana, where they play through, like, I think it was from the demo, and it's not like they don't go over any of the story stuff, it's just showing them doing some of the tactics battles. But yes, that is like one of the few things I knew, is that he plays like the main dude. And if you, he
plays the main dude's best friend, but yes.
Sure, yeah. Well, he's one of the main dudes.
Ono Kensho is the main character, and then he's like the deuteragonist. Yeah.
Yes. So if people want to see footage of Nakamura Yuichi playing that game, it is on that Washiagana YouTube channel. I don't think there would be English subs on it, but it's still cool.
Minor spoiler: Nakamura Yuichi, about halfway through the game, his character does adopt a mask and an alter ego, and that made me laugh very hard because, of course, he is Mr. Bushido himself.
Yes, I think he makes a brief reference to something that felt like something like that without him actually being able to say it. But yes, I vaguely remember him saying something about like, my character changes partway through in a way that people might not be actually that surprised by. It was something like that.
Yes.
I wonder what that is.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, cool medieval story performed by a world-class voice cast, and then great tactical battles. For me, it's a dream come true. It's probably my favorite game of the year behind Elden Ring. I really would recommend it highly. And we've got another one of these HD 2D games coming in a couple weeks with Live Alive, the remake of that classic game that's never been released outside Japan. And I'm excited for that, too. We actually just learned it's got a song by Hironobu Kageyama, the guy who did all the Dragon Ball themes, and it looks really fun. So anyway, yeah, Square Enix, weird company in some ways. They're making a lot of good JRPGs and games in this style these days, and it's fun. I like, and not like a bunch of like new Final Fantasies or something. Like, I like that there's this focus on just completely new IP, sometimes like inspired by something like Final Fantasy Tactics, but it's not like Final Fantasy Tactics 2, right? It's just a full new game, and I think that's cool.
Have there been any triangles in it yet?
I don't know why it's called Triangle Strategy. I have to be honest. Like, other than it is about 3 countries who are, like, warring, there's no, like, weapon triangle. There's nothing in the gameplay that is like a rock, paper, scissors mechanic that would imply the title Triangle Strategy. It's not like Octopath Traveler where, it's about 8 paths that you travel. That makes sense. I'm not 100% sure why they called this Triangle Strategy. Also, it's just a bad name that tells you nothing about the game.
Yes. Yeah, Octopath Traveler was always ridiculous sounding, but at least it sounded vaguely like... Because remember, it was originally called Project Octopath Traveler, like it was not the actual title, and then they just took the project off. It was like, that's still a weird title, but at least it sounds like a title of something. Whereas, like, Project Triangle Strategy, which is how this was originally announced, sounds like a Project temp title. Like, that doesn't sound like the title of a real game. And so that was one of the ones where they dropped off the project. I'm like... Okay, then sure. Just Triangle Strategy sounds like it's like a game that would have come preloaded on like Windows 98 next to Minesweeper is what Triangle Strategy evokes to me.
Yeah. Oh man. Anyway, it's weird. You want to move on to the news?
Yeah, what's going on in the news?
The news has been fucking nuts this week. I woke up Thursday morning to the news that Boris Johnson had resigned as Prime Minister of the UK. We then got the news that the author of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Kazuki Takahashi, had been found dead at the age of 60. A couple hours after that, we learned that James Caan, the beloved actor, had passed away at the age of 82. That evening, in American time, we got the news that the longest-serving prime minister in the history of Japan, Shinzo Abe, had been murdered in an assassination at a campaign rally. And then the day after that, we got, like, a bunch more. There was Gregory Itzin, the guy who played President Logan on 24, and a bunch of other villains died. The guy who played the shut-in character on Twin Peaks died on Thursday. And the guy from Sopranos, Tony Sirico, right? What's his name?
Yeah, Tony Sirico, who played Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos.
That was a crazy 2 days, Sean. That was a lot of death, a lot of world events. I don't even know where we want to start with all of that.
Yeah, no, I was with you that it was just like, it's one of those where it just felt like God was playing a joke on people or some shit. It's just, it's such a bizarre, it was a very bizarre assortment of events that felt like every time you looked at the news, you're like, what the fuck is happening today? Like ranging from things like almost kind of like comical in how all of it happened and like, you know, appropriate in how it happened with like Boris Johnson to like shocking and tragic with Kazuki Takahashi's death. To just like, what is even happening in the world with Abe's assassination? Just weird.
Yeah, I mean, I've especially, like, I think anyone who's like lived in Japan, there was just an extra level of shock about the Abe thing. Because I remember I told my brother that, and he lived in Japan for over a year. And I think he had the same thing I saw from some people on Twitter I follow who have lived in Japan for some amount of time. And it's just like, there's one thing to know that Japan is a country with no gun violence. There's another thing to have lived there for a while and just know that it's like in terms of crime, it's just a very, very different society. And then you hear this news and it's just nuts. You know, like hard to even process.
I mean, the guy had to, you know, he home manufactured his own firearm out of home materials and like fired shotgun shells electronically or like, with electricity. Which it's just like, I mean, I think it tells you something about like gun regulation stuff, that the only time you get like a really high profile shooting like this is when it is something to the scale of assassinating the most powerful political figure in the entire country. Like obviously Abe was not actual prime minister anymore, but he still wielded the most political capital of any politician in Japan. And it's like
the current PM is his protege.
Yes, so, and so like it has to rise to that level where like someone who is going to do something at that scale is going to have the like commitment to that to go through whatever like things are going to be put in place to prevent that person from getting access to a weapon, to the point where he was like an member of the self-defense force in Japan, which is their military organization. And then he knew how to home craft a firearm. Like that is such an extreme go to like do all of that stuff. And it is like a really interesting and kind of strange contrast to look at that versus like America and the kind of gun violence that we encounter on a daily basis here. Yeah.
Well, anyway, we're not a politics or world event podcast, so I don't think we have much to say on that other than Jesus, just it's weird. It's fucking crazy. Very crazy. But I want to talk about Kazuki Takahashi, Sean. For those who don't know, he was the author of the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, which ran for 38 volumes in original Shonen Jump, or in Weekly Shonen Jump. And of course, Yu-Gi-Oh has become one of the biggest franchises on the planet. I actually wonder if like Americans today even know that Yu-Gi-Oh is something that has like never been off the air in Japan. There is a spin-off every single year, and like there's maybe a week or two off between them, but since the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters I say original, the second Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, the one that was a hit, it has just always been on in different forms. Obviously, Takahashi has had less and less input on it as it's gone along. I think he had some input on Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, which was the first spin-off, and then it got to the people riding on motorbikes doing duels in 5Ds, and I think he was checked out at that point.
I mean, I don't know if you've seen like any like modern Yu-Gi-Oh like the card game is it's
I've
just
seen clips. I know
it's just a different game at this point. And I saw a video because the new online version of it came out. I was like, oh, I wonder. I like Yu-Gi-Oh, and I looked at it. I was like, I don't know what this is anymore. This isn't. It's been like 10 years since I knew.
It's terrible. I have what's the one? I think it's called like Evolution of the Duel or something was the game from a couple years ago. Not the free to play one, but an actual like you buy it on console. It was on Xbox, it was on PlayStation. I have it on Switch. And that one's really good because you can go through the different campaigns and play with like original Yu-Gi-Oh rules. You can play with the rules as of GX, and then I start to lose because then you get into Synchro and XYZ and all this stuff that I have no idea about. And basically, modern Yu-Gi-Oh, if you play it online, what it is you go first and you play a card face down, and then the opponent plays for 25 minutes on their own turn and beats you through a crazy series of like things they're able to do. That game is like broken to the moon at this point. But original Yu-Gi-Oh, the card game, was a blast, and it came from a great manga. And you know, just to put a little of my history on the table, I think you've probably heard me talk about this before, but like Yu-Gi-Oh was one of the first anime I ever really got into. I mean, I got into it before I knew what anime was. Like, at a time when I wouldn't have known it was from Japan, right? Like, I remember learning that Yu-Gi-Oh! Was from Japan, and that the version we got was, like, censored up the ass, you know? I probably didn't say censored up the ass at the time, but, like, very censored. And so, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has, like, always been in my life. It was one of the first manga I ever got into and read. I remember reading the early volumes of Yu-Gi-Oh! And being just shocked because that's the stuff that is not adapted in the animated adaptation we got over here. And early Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dark and weird. But I reread the manga last year. I did that big long Twitter thread where I was keeping the kill count because a lot of people die in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. But ultimately that thread really just became me celebrating the manga because, especially on reread, I think I was really, you know, unsure if it would hold up for me as an adult, but when I reread it, like, it's just a great manga. He was a great artist, he was a great storyteller, came up with amazing characters. The game Duel Monsters is, like, it's a game that makes for really good drama in that kind of, like, anime context. And I think when that manga really takes off, and it takes some time to find itself, but when it really takes off, it's one of my favorite manga I've ever read. I think everything, particularly the second half of it, all of Battle City and then the final arc in Ancient Egypt, is just really, really good manga. Beautifully drawn, very distinctive style, really great characters, a lot of heart. It's just a really good shonen manga. And I can't recommend it to people enough. And I was glad to see yesterday, or over the weekend, after he died, an outpouring of, oh, I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people who've read this manga and are talking about it, because sometimes Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a punchline, and it deserves to be more than that. It's a very special series, and I hope this encourages people to go read it, because, you know, even if you watch the original anime, I keep saying original, if you watch Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters in Japanese, the 224 episode series, that in and of itself is still substantially different from the manga. And I would love to see them one day do like a proper like adaptation of the manga all the way through with everything in it, because it's such a special series. But, you know, it's all out in English. It's easy to find. It's all on the Shonen Jump app if you have an iPad or something. And it's worth reading. It's fantastic work, and his work meant a lot to me. And I've also just been reflecting on the fact that, like, anime and manga as we know it now are young enough mediums that like, we haven't lost a lot of people in the history of it yet, to a certain degree, like the way you have with film or something, right? Like, you know, Osamu Tezuka died this century, died in the 2000s. Isao Takahata just died a couple of years ago. Hayao Miyazaki is still alive. Yoshiki Tomino is still alive. A lot of our favorite mangaka are still around. And losing Kazuki Takahashi, one of the only like major mangaka or anime figures in my life who's passed away, and it's very sad.
Yeah, and it was like, a tragic sudden passing that, like, because it was he was like scuba diving or something like that.
He was scuba diving, yeah.
And so like some accident happened and he drowned, and so it's very upsetting. Because I never stuck with like the Yu-Gi-Oh manga and anime all the way through. I fell off of it at a certain point, but I also grew up with it, so yeah. So like I think through like about like the Battle City stuff, I think is about how far I ever got in the anime. But I'm pretty sure the first manga I ever read was like Murder Yu-Gi-Oh, like the original stuff. And finding that, because I think I had heard that it was that like that's what like it was like a thing that like would get passed around at the playground, is that someone's like older brother showed them that, like, it's like, oh, you think that that's what Yu-Gi-Oh is? Here's what Yu-Gi-Oh actually is. Here's Yu-Gi murdering people, and you hear about that, and it's like, I gotta see that, and got that Yu-Gi-Oh from Barnes and Nobles, because I read a lot of American comic books but never really read manga, but I watched a lot of anime stuff on like Toonami and stuff like that. And yeah, like I still have those copies of the, like, they are very old and beaten up at this point, but old English versions of those original couple of volumes of Yu-Gi-Oh. And then I played the card game obsessively when I was in elementary school, because all my friends did.
Yeah.
And I think it's a thing of where there have been a lot of franchises in Japan that came out after Yu-Gi-Oh that tried to capture that magic, and some of them are kind of successful to certain extents, but all of them went about it in the wrong way, in that they came up with a card game and then tried to make a manga / anime to sell the card game. And I think the thing about Yu-Gi-Oh is that's not what it was, right? It was the card game was invented as like one of many games that like were played in Yu-Gi-Oh, and that like the Duel Monster stuff became very popular, and so he stuck with it. But as you said earlier, it was like there as a storytelling tool, as a frame for these sort of like dramatic, basically action stories and drama stories between the characters, and like that's kind of the core of what it is. And then then the rules got kind of like finalized and made official and turned into like rules you could actually play, because everybody who is a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh knows that like the early stuff you see on TV is like, they are not playing by any of, like, you can't play this way, so you will get beaten up on the playground if you try to pull the shit that some of these people pull in the anime, because the rules are made there for like the convenience of the storytelling. But like that to me, it just like speaks to the quality of what Yu-Gi-Oh was, and like to the quality of Takahashi Sensei's work, right? That it was about like the story and characters and drama first, and people fell in love with that, and then from that grew like one of the biggest global media entertainment franchises, which is like the card game and all the associated properties, and then the later anime that come forward as like a co-marketing thing to then do market all of your card game changes and stuff like that. But the core of it was like that storytelling, and that is a thing that like Yu-Gi-Oh is very special for.
Absolutely. And, some of the most, anime is an industry with lots of fun, crazy hair. Takahashi Sensei was one of the best at doing crazy hair. I mean, Yugi himself is one of the most just legendary hair designs in the history of anime, one of the most iconic, but it's all throughout. Everyone has coiffed, poofy hair. It's amazing. Just in general, like a very distinctive style, which is part of what's fun about it. Yeah, I love it. I've still got, you talk about having old volumes, I've got right here on my bookshelf right next to my desk, all 38 of the original volumes in English, first printings, all of them. Some of them are pretty yellowed, but still totally readable. I have so many memories of various Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games I played as a kid. The ones that were best were the ones that just presented the card game in a good way to play it, which were really the GBA games. You had the Eternal Duelist Soul, and you had Worldwide Edition, which was like the first Battle City one. Those were fucking great. Any of the, like, basically GBA had the best ones, and then on consoles you would get really weird experimental Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that were kind of terrible. I remember a PlayStation 1 Yu-Gi-Oh! Game that had a multiplayer mode where, because you would just be sharing the screen with the person you were dueling with, what they did is that all the cards had numbers associated, and you had to memorize or write down the numbers so that you wouldn't know what the opponent had. I guess it was impossible to play. You mentioned on Twitter the other day the GameCube game, The False-Bound Kingdom, which is like the weird Yu-Gi-Oh! Isekai game where you play... Is it tactical RPG? What the hell was it?
It's like a pseudo real-time strategy game. Like, it is broadly in the same genre as like StarCraft, but it's like when you do StarCraft, and then your monsters fight or your units fight, it turns into like a I don't even think it's really a turn-based strategy game because I think it turns into like the monsters fight automatically, like Monster Rancher almost. If I remember correctly, I've not played that game in a long time, but I've kept that copy. I said on Twitter that it is a thing that a friend got for me. I think on my 10th or 11th birthday. And I played that game and I was like, this is terrible, and I didn't hang out with that person anymore. Because the friend that gets you the shit video game, like that's how you know who your real friends are. Who gets you the like, oh, I found this like shitty Yu-Gi-Oh game that they probably got like used at GameStop or some shit, or EB Games at the mall before it was even GameStop. Then give it to me for my fucking birthday. Fuck off. I ain't hanging out with that kid anymore.
I played so many of these back in the day. Most of them were terrible. There were also like GBA RPGs that tried to like do the story of the series. There was one called the Sacred Yu-Gi-Oh! The Sacred Cards, which was the Battle City arc. But instead of what all it needed to be was you walk around Battle City and do fun duels. But instead they had changed the dueling system to try to make it more like the show, but it just made it bad. Where like they got rid of like, it just like if you knew the actual card game, it was unrecognizable and kind of unplayable. There were ones like that. I remember before Game Boy Advance had like just enough graphical fidelity to do the actual card game, you would have the Game Boy Color attempts where they couldn't even have 2 rows of cards, so it was just completely fucked. Yu-Gi-Oh! If you want a fun trip, like open up your emulator software and just start downloading ROMs of random old Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, because they had to try quite a bit before they were able to like actually make it work. It's hilarious.
Yeah, because that is one of the things that when I jailbroke my 3DS or my 2DS, I guess, I did put a bunch of old Yu-Gi-Oh! Games and ran through a bunch of those, because I did have one of those Game Boy ones you're talking about where like it is archaic, it can't really do the rules, and it feels like because I would need to look at the dates, but it almost feels like it was maybe made before the rules were finalized, because I remember it being like, oh, this is kind of like the game they play on the show, not really the game you play if you bought the actual cards. But I still remember very distinctly when I was a kid, like Yu-Gi-Oh cards actually like the cards themselves coming out, and going with my friends to 7-Eleven. And everyone getting the starter packs, and there were 2. One was the Dark Magician one was the Blue Eyes White Dragon one, and you immediately knew what kind of person someone was based on are they a good person or a bad person? Did you get the Blue Eyes White Dragon set in case you are a good smart person? Did you get the Dark Magician one? Why did you get the Dark Magician one? He's only got 2,500 attack. The Blue Eyes White Dragon has 3,000 attack. It's just a better card. Why would you ever get the Dark Magician one? It made no sense, and I was a dragon style player in my halcyon days as a young Yu-Gi-Oh boy in elementary school.
Blue Eyes White Dragon, a great card, great monster design. And one other piece of Kazuki Takahashi's legacy we just have to say is he invented maybe the most extra character in the history of anime, and that is Seto Kaiba.
Yes.
Just a guy who will kill himself for card games. I was rewatching the clip earlier today where it's the one where they're dueling on the roof at Duelist Kingdom, and he threatens to jump off and kill himself if he loses, and he literally has the line, and it's so great because it's Kenjiro Tsuda is like, he says, Yugi, slit my throat with your card, and he drags his hand across his throat, and I'm like, this guy is so over the fucking top, and he's amazing. In the movie that Takahashi wrote a couple years ago, that came out, there's like a sequel to the original Yu-Gi-Oh show. That one is all about Kaiba trying to find a path to the afterlife to duel the Pharaoh again. Like, that is how extra Seto Kaiba is. He's fucking great.
I mean, one of the first things I saw after the news of Takahashi's death came out was on Twitter. Kenjiro Tsuda posted a picture of him holding the Blue Eyes White Dragon card. That was because I saw like a bunch of stuff about the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh has died. I'm like, what? And then I looked at Twitter, and that was like the first tweet I saw, and that hit me.
That would have hit me. I didn't see that. God, that makes me sad. Because Kenjiro Tsuda, if you have not heard Japanese Kaiba, it is just one of the best performances ever. He knew what that character was. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of the defining Kenjiro Tsuda performance. But anyway, I love Yu-Gi-Oh! I love his work. One other thing I did want to recommend, by the way. I just picked this up yesterday. This just came out in English in June. So it is Takahashi's last published work, I believe. which is a Marvel crossover he did called Secret Reverse, and we just got the trade paperback of it here. It published in Japan in 2019 and 2020 on the Digital Jump Plus app, but it is a crossover Kazuki Takahashi wrote with, he did it himself, but Marvel asked if he would write something, and it is a Spider-Man Iron Man story where they are in Japan for a game convention, and they meet a guy named Kaio, not Kaiba, Kaio, who is just the most, he's a Yu-Gi-Oh character. You can see it, Sean. He's just a Yu-Gi-Oh character, and he has a card game, and he's using the card game to cause chaos, and Spider-Man and Iron Man have to fight him. It's not like the deepest or greatest story you'll ever read, but if you want to see Spider-Man and Iron Man basically fight a Yu-Gi-Oh villain, it's great. The coloring and the art and everything is just fucking gorgeous. I love how Takahashi draws Spider-Man. There's some great moments of that. There's some really fun Iron Man scenes. It's just a really treat of a book, a little treat of a book. I got the trade here. You can also get it digitally on Viz's various apps, and it's gorgeous. And I do believe this is his last published work, and it's really fun.
Yeah, I'll need to pick that up because Yu-Gi-Oh and Spider-Man, that sounds like a good combo.
I think you'd have fun with it, Sean. It's like a 100-page one shot, but for what it is, it's very good. I also just wanted to mention James Caan because that one hit hard too. Because James Caan, great actor, obviously in The Godfather, in Thief, all sorts of other movies. In Elf for a Modern Generation, that's a great Christmas movie, and he is awesome in that movie. Just a great actor. And then it was the kind of thing where just the outpouring of Twitter love was a lot of stories that made you realize he was a really fucking cool dude too. Yeah. And I loved seeing that.
Yeah, no, he's James Caan is one of the all-time great character actors, Yeah.
I recently rewatched The Godfather when the 4K set came out, and Sonny is just one of the best parts of the original Godfather, which is saying something because the original Godfather is one of the best movies ever made. My favorite James Caan movie is Thief, the Michael Mann film, which is just one of the best crime movies ever made. You can't go wrong. He was a great actor, and it's a bummer. Yeah. Anything else in the news to talk about before we move on to Thor, Sean?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, then, let's go ahead and move on to Thor, Love and Thunder. Spoilers from here on out if you haven't seen the movie yet. I was disappointed by this one, Sean.
Yeah.
We'll talk about what went wrong, but I guess let's just kick in. What are your sort of overall feelings about this movie now that we don't have to tiptoe around anything?
Yeah, it's very disappointing. It feels like a movie that you can see, it's got all the pieces in it to make a really good Thor Ragnarok style movie in terms of having a really strong fundamental thematic core underpinning everything, and then having all the humor and the drama extending out from that core dramatic core, which is what makes Thor Ragnarok a great movie and one of the best Marvel films. And you can see that it has all those toys, right? It has all the pieces out there to play with its characters, with the villain, all of it's there. But it doesn't connect any of the dots really. And so it is a very kind of confused movie that it's got a bunch of very startling, jarring, junction points in the plot where you'll have a scene that just feels what the fuck is this scene? And it's got the clunkiest exposition you have heard in your goddamn life. Or all of a sudden a new plot point will be introduced or a plot point will be adjusted, everything with that omnipotent city. That whole sequence I think is disastrous in a plot sense, where it doesn't feel like a coherent, congealed vision for the core fundamental story ever carries through more than a couple of scenes in a row, and then it kind of becomes a slightly different version of itself over and over and over again. And it's incredibly frustrating because a lot of the individual pieces in moments can be fun. It's got a lot of really good action beats. It's got a lot of good jokes. It's got a lot of good performances. I still love Chris Hemsworth as Thor. I think Natalie Portman is great as Jane, and I like a lot of the ideas there. But this is a very good example of a movie that is a lot less than the sum of its parts.
A lot less, and it's just messy as a production. It is. The script feels very unfinished to me. You're talking about scenes that kind of thud and have bad exposition. There's just a lot of scenes in this movie that feel like not just the first draft version of a scene, but the placeholder version of a scene. I'm writing, because I've done this with like creative writing and even academic writing sometimes. You're writing through and you write the placeholder version of like, okay, this is the scene where we have to establish that they have to go to Omnipotent City and do X, Y, and Z. And basically in the movie Thor Love and Thunder, they stand in a circle and go, we need to go to Omnipotent City and do X, Y, and Z because of, A, B, and C, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like very like awkward and like this scene isn't finished. I think the character writing is just abysmally thin. I agree Chris Hemsworth is great, but I think this is the thinnest version of Thor we've ever had.
He has no character arc in this movie, which is a very big issue. That's like one of those plot things that it's just like it kind of feels like they forgot to give him an actual character arc at a certain point.
Exactly. Just everyone, there's a couple of moments where they actually kind of call back to the older Thor movies, and I felt nothing, but I wanted to feel something, but I felt nothing because it didn't feel like this was that character. It didn't feel like it was in a continuity with all of that because it was so thin. And then on a aesthetic, like production level, it's an unmitigated disaster. It's like, it is the worst special effects I think I've ever seen in a movie, at least like a modern like blockbuster that had real money behind it, and this was a $250 million production. It is the cheapest looking big budget movie I have ever seen. This is the first Marvel production that made use of the stagecraft technology, which we've talked about before. It was invented for The Mandalorian, it was used on Dune, it was used on The Batman, very well on The Batman. Just an utter like disaster here, I think, visually. The movie has no sense, I think, of how to build geography or locations or just kind of just general visual storytelling. It's so slack, and I'll get into that more later, but it is like almost offensive to the eyes, I think, how bad this movie looks. It's got an absolute nothing burger of a score by Michael Giacchino, who I think was asleep at the wheel for this one. It uses a couple of fun Guns N' Roses songs, but notably it uses like the 3 most famous Guns N' Roses songs. It doesn't go for any deep cuts. It's I don't think it's a bad movie necessarily. I think it's bad in parts. Because the other thing is, I like the ending, in a theoretical sense at least. I think going for the ending where Jane dies, and there is this kid who is the kid of the villain, and Thor takes him in and becomes a father, that could be such a powerful ending. It's an ending to a completely different movie.
Yes.
Like, you get to the point where Jane dies, and I'm like, they did not write a movie up to this point that ended with Natalie Portman dying, because it's too silly and too glib to do that as the ending. And it's the same thing with what happens with Gore and Christian Bale and then the daughter and all of that. It's like, this movie was too glib and too silly to build to, like, it would be like if Batman and Robin ended with Alfred actually dying and then like Batman mourning. It would be like, that's not the movie you wrote. This is so weird.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good example of just like, it feels like that constantly happens throughout the film. That like you just get a scene that feels like it's just from a very different version of this movie. And it's not as if it's like completely disconnected, but it's like all the connections are very loose all throughout the film. And that's like the thing that makes it feel either like it had like no meaningful pre-production whatsoever, and or it had a lot of like weird stuff afterwards in the edit that happened. And we know that there's like a bunch of stuff, because I was reading some interviews with like Christian Bale and stuff, and there's a lot of actors we know that filmed stuff for this movie. Who we know that Jeff Goldblum filmed stuff, Peter Dinklage filmed stuff, and Lena Headey all filmed things for this movie, and none of them are in the actual final cut. Peter Dinklage was in Infinity War, and he would have played his same character there. Goldblum obviously would have played his character there. Who Lena Headey was going to play was never actually announced, but she was cut from the final cut of the movie.
I think I did read somewhere else it was another one of the gods. It was like Hela, or not Hela. Hela is from Thor Ragnarok. It was another like Greek god. And these were all cameos. Lena Headey explained she was on set for a day.
Okay.
I don't know if I put much stock in the post-production issue, because I think the movie is like, there's no scene other than kind of the black and white scene in the Shadow Realm kind of comes together aesthetically. The movie is such an aesthetic disaster top to bottom that this feels to me like a pre-production problem. Like, having a couple of cameos cut is not weird. Marvel movies have had that all the time. It's Taika Waititi is a busy guy. Since Thor Ragnarok, he made Jojo Rabbit. His name is on like 10 different TV shows, none of which he has been the showrunner on, but he has directed and written on What We Do in the Shadows and Reservation Dogs and Our Flag Means Death and like several other things. He's a really busy guy. Ragnarok was a while ago. It was 5 years now. But he's had a lot in those 5 years. This, and I think just the script and everything, it feels to me like this is a movie that just kind of like went in without much of a direction. It was one of the post-COVID productions. Just, I think it's a first draft that didn't get finished is what it feels like to me.
But one thing I also wonder about, though, with this movie is that the, like, core thematic underpinnings that it sort of, like, suggests to repeatedly, but never commits to in any way, are all religious. And it's a thing where, like, I'm curious about if there were, like, studio notes or something in an earlier version of this movie that would have made stronger connections to some things, because, like, I think that America is perfectly willing and happy to have a movie that is critical of colonialism, because even people whose actual politics are actually very imperialistic and colonialistic will say and agree with anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist ideas, because it sounds, when you say this, like, that's fine, but then they don't actually support it in any of their, like, actual shit.
It's
but
like
in America,
broad anti-racism or something, right?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Like everyone's like, yeah, racism is bad, and so it's like that. Even if racists will say that racism is bad, right? But in America, if you release a movie where people are going to interpret that movie as being like anti-religious or anti-Christian in some way, shape, or form, or even questioning of it, your movie will be boycotted, right? Like there will be organizations that will, like, take very strong offense at that. And this is a movie that, like, just to, like, I think illustrate very clearly the point of this, of, like, where, like, the thematic stuff, the pieces are there and it never makes the connections. Here are two things in this movie. One thing in this movie is you have an antagonist whose entire motivation is revenge against the gods for their, like, cruel indifference towards the suffering of the people that worship them. And then another thing in this movie is one of the protagonist characters is dying from cancer. And those two characters are paralleled really heavily. I mean, these are both characters that are also sustained in their life by, like, the magic weapons they wield, and they both die at the end of the movie after their weapons have been destroyed. Like, they're really heavily paralleled, but it never actually draws any connection there between the things that Gore is facing and the things that Jane is facing, right? And it's like, that feels like that is so, you can't put those things in juxtaposition and not see the connective material there, but the movie doesn't have any scene with Jane that reflects on those thematic underpinnings in any way, shape, or form.
Well, and this is where you get into the whole confusion of the God side of the movie, and I'm not the only one who has been confused by this. In this movie, it is fucking coherent what a god is and isn't, where they come from, what the hell is going on, why Thor wants to save them. Because our only significant interaction with gods in this movie is the first scene where Gore's daughter dies. It's such a dark opening. It is such a weirdly dark, bleak opening to this very glib movie. But you have that, and then there's this, glib, awful god who dismisses him and Gore murders. And then our only other significant scene with gods is in the big alien planet they go to, and they meet Zeus, played by Russell Crowe doing a Borat voice, which doesn't work. And they're all awful, and they're terrible, and the world would be better off if they were all dead. And other than Thor himself, I guess, would die, why do they want to save the gods? That is a question that is never satisfactorily answered in this movie. The only real urgency is from the kids, but they rescue the kids, and then they're still like, oh no, we have to stop Gore. I'm like, no you don't. It's fucking fine. The gods are terrible. I'm not even sure what they are, but they're terrible. And then there's what you're talking about, Sean, which is that there is no thematic unity. Like, when you say it out loud to me, the, like, paralleling between Jane and Gore, you're 100% right, that's there. I hadn't even thought about that, because that is not, like, front conscious of the movie's mind. I was trying to figure out, like, how does Gore's arc reflect on Thor? Because this is a movie that ends with Thor adopting Gore's daughter, and I couldn't find it anywhere. Like, early in the movie, my prediction was that, is this going to end with Thor, like, giving up his godhood? And that's how he survives, blah, blah, blah. And it's never reckoned with. Like, there's no scene where Thor is thinking about, like, I'm a god, what is my role to people, blah, blah. Is Thor a god? I'm not sure. All of this kind of stuff, and it's just completely incoherent.
Yeah, and it's like the fundamental problem with the movie is that it just doesn't kind of, like, focus in on what fundamentally is the movie actually about. Because again, it's got a bunch of those pieces. And you can imagine a movie that like, and it, you know, it doesn't have to be like, you know, angry ranting atheist or something, but something that takes like religion and spirituality seriously. And cancer is a thing that, like, a very common experience is that people who have cancer or who know someone who has cancer have a crisis of faith. Like, that's a
Yes.
that's a broadly universal experience. And so, like, putting that stuff in the movie, it feels like the movie is begging to draw those lines. The movie, I think, desperately wants to be about Jane a lot more than it is about Thor, but it is ultimately a Thor, like Thor Odinson movie and not a Jane movie, even though she's the only one who kind of has a character arc, and Thor has no character arc at all. And it's very frustrating to see those pieces be there and to be able to imagine Thor Ragnarok, like, the way that Thor Ragnarok structured itself and approached its plot would have been able to do this fantastically. And Thor Love and Thunder doesn't do any of the stuff that movie did, even though it's made by the same people.
Yeah. And I think that is a compelling point about if there's any evidence that there's tampering somewhere going on, it's that it's gods in a completely defanged mythical sense, right? Mm-hmm. It's gods in the sense of like Zeus, but not Zeus as a religious icon, Zeus as a figure from pop culture myth, the same way Thor in these movies has been a source of pop culture myth, not a religion or anything like that. And so what we're supposed to take from the god stuff is incoherent, right? Because it's not clear what they are or what they're viewed as. Because if they're just big pop culture myths, who gives a shit? Kill them, don't kill them, it doesn't matter, right? They have no bearing on us. But if you're trying to talk about it in a religious sense, that's interesting. What is the role of religion in Jane Foster's life? I would love to know that. That would be like a pertinent character detail. The scene early on when she's getting chemo and she's talking to the kid about her own science. What if that kid was reading the Bible or something and they had to have a conversation about that? Well, Disney would never, ever, ever let that scene happen. So we will never know.
Yeah, because it's like, it's impossible to know unless someone like talks about it at some point. If like there was any production like interference in that way or like studio notes or something that prevented it from going in that direction. But like, I can't imagine it being able to go in that direction, whether or not that was like explicitly stated or not. Like, I can imagine in a perfect universe this movie being able to approach those questions in like a mature, adult, and interesting fashion, but I can't imagine that movie actually being made in the modern American business, you know?
There's two things that are off limits in modern Hollywood, and it is sex and it is religion. Yeah. You cannot have honest depictions of sex or sexuality. Straight, gay, whatever. The most you can do is like a chaste kiss on the cheek. You know, in this movie...
or like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, which this movie does a few times with like I like ladies, and I'm a lady, is like that's your like gay rep in this movie, right?
There's a shot of Valkyrie's hand, not like Valkyrie's body and her hand is attached to it, but just her disembodied hand, body out of frame, touching another woman whose body is out of frame, hand. A shot that you can really easily cut out if you need to, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's its gay representation, right? So you can't do sex, can't do sexuality, none of that. Everybody is a Ken doll. They're men and women in theory. They have no parts, right? And everything has to be aggressively secular. You can't deal with religion. Good or bad. Because, like, you know, you're talking about, like, protests against movies. Martin Scorsese is a good example of a filmmaker who has dealt with religion in, like, really interesting, profound ways. Last Temptation of Christ and Silence being two great examples. Neither of those are anti-religion movies. They are movies about the, like, actual difficulties and the good parts, too, of dealing with faith in the real world, in its complexities. And they are movies, I think those movies are religious acts for Martin Scorsese. They are actual evocations of faith. Well, Last Temptation of Christ was so, you know, heavily protested, people almost died at some of the screenings. Mm-hmm. You know, Silence was completely buried when it came out by Fox. And so, you know, and Silence, by the way, was his last theatrical movie. His next movie, Irishman, was for Netflix, and his next movie after that is for Netflix. Like, Martin Scorsese has not been back in movie theaters since Silence. Religion is just, like, not something you can get into mainstream movie theaters, which is too bad, because there's all sorts of interesting stories to tell around religion, I think, outside of a pro-anti frame, right? Like, you know, I want to see more of it. Like, Miss Marvel is on TV right now, and that one broaches it slightly more in that her family is explicitly Muslim. They go to church, they pray, but it has to do it culturally, not at any point like Kamala Khan is talking about what the teachings mean or something like that, you know? And that's the most Marvel has ever gone on religion. You know, Moon Knight has a problem too, where that character is Jewish in the comics, and they just have to lightly allude to it in the show and never get into what does Judaism mean to him culturally or spiritually. And so, yeah, Thor: Love and Thunder, the most it can do is have Russell Crowe as a fat, you know, funny Zeus doing a Borat voice. And that's what gods are in this movie about killing gods? In which case, kill him. I fucking hate him. Just go ahead and kill him. Yeah. It's fine.
And the other stuff, like, you know, and I don't even know if this is intentional or not, but it was on the top of my mind because at a certain point this movie gets very boring, even though it's not very long, because the connective tissue is so thin, you just get bored watching it. So I was just sitting there kind of actively thinking, like, okay, what is this movie trying to do? Like, what is the thematic material? And I started thinking about the religion and spirituality stuff. And then you get to the end of the movie where they all go through the portal and they're in Tanjiro's mind from Kimetsu no Yaiba, from Mugen Train. So it's like, that's where we know that, like, the Eternal sits, and you're, you know, if you can reach Tanjiro's spiritual core, you get your wish granted. But when they're there is a lot of, like, Judeo-Christian imagery around, like, I forget what it's called, but there's, like, that, like, Renaissance art, sort of, like, iconic pose of, like, Mary cradling Jesus, right? And there's, like, a specific Italian term for it. But that's, like, that motif is visually replicated across the movie multiple times at the beginning and then at the end. And that is, like, the one place in which Thor and Gore the God Butcher are, like, paralleled in some way directly, is that they both have that moment of Thor cradling Jane in that pose, and then at the beginning of the movie Gore cradles his daughter, and at the end of the movie Gore is cradled by his daughter in that pose. And it's like, and so there is like light Judeo-Christian imagery, and then obviously, like, you can read into, like, the way it uses the word love in a very, like, Judeo-Christian faith sense. So those pieces are there. Like, I don't know, that stuff to me is like, I don't know if they ever thought about that, because that's the kind of stuff that would pop up whether you're trying to or not, because it's just so culturally just there. But, like, that material is there for the taking, but the movie cannot and will not, like, take any of it, and it's just is one of the fundamental things where this movie just feels like it cannot get its shit together.
No, it's so many different movies going on at once, and I think the side that is about the gods and killing the gods and gore is a terrible movie. It's one of the worst things Marvel's ever done. It's unbearable. I think that scene in the what is it called? It's not the Parthenon, but they're in, like, God City or whatever.
The Omnipotent City, which is
Omnipotent City, okay.
I'm going to guess it's probably from the comics, but I am not familiar with it, and it is a very dumb name.
Omnipotent City, that entire, like, 45-minute scene, it's not actually 45 minutes, but it feels that long, is one of the worst things Marvel's ever produced. It's just a terrible scene.
Yeah.
Disastrous. I think Christian Bale in this movie is bad in a way only a great actor can truly be bad. Like, in a way, like, someone who has a lot of tools in the toolbox and they are not being given any direction about how to use them. That's the kind of bad performance you get from Christian Bale here. It's a special kind of bad.
Some scenes he's really good, and then other scenes you're like, what is he even like the one I think about is when he's, like, taunting the little kids. It's just like, what is happening? Like, is this supposed to be the same character? This is fucking bizarre.
It reminds me to a degree of, like, Jesse Eisenberg in Batman v Superman, where the idea of Jesse Eisenberg as a young tech bro Lex Luthor is actually a great idea on the surface. I think that's a good modernization. And then, but he is just directed in so many different directions that there's no character underneath it, right? Yeah. It's just off the wall. This isn't that bad, but it's bad. So all of that stuff's awful. The Thor and Jane part of the movie, I generally like. Mm-hmm. I think the montage about Thor and Jane's romance together is one of my favorite little sequences Marvel has ever made, because it feels very, like, human and mature about, like, the course of this relationship. It's one of the only scenes in the movie that takes place on an actual set, because they built Jane's apartment and it's not just a digital backdrop that they're standing in front of. So there's actual staging and blocking in that scene. You know, and I like some of their scenes throughout because I love the first two Thor movies, particularly the second one, and I miss that side of the movie. I honestly think one of the problems of this is that I think they should have had, like, Kat Dennings in it more. I think they should have had more ties to, like, Valkyrie. They don't have anything for her to do. Tessa Thompson is very bored in this movie, and it's not her fault. She doesn't have anything to play, so of course she's bored. Why wasn't that just put Kat Dennings in there and have her along for the ride and be able to have some character history there that would be more meaningful? Valkyrie doesn't know Jane. So all of that is a problem. So there's like, my point is, there's sides of it I like, and there's sides of it I hate, and it vacillates so wildly between them, and then the ending is baffling because it tries to pull it all together, and suddenly this was a movie about Thor becoming a dad, I guess.
Yeah, and it's that thing where it's like, on paper, it's a great ending to a different movie.
Yeah.
Like, it's like,
Yes.
it is a great sequence. But like, the movie does not build up to it at all. Like, there's a couple, like, I think there's like a line earlier in the movie, right, where Korg says, I think Thor would make a great dad. And that really felt like, when you actually see the whole movie, you think back to it, it's like, that is a very good, like, oh, I wrote this ending, I gotta put a line, maybe something got cut or something. We have to just shove in a line somewhere where we introduce the ending, because then it's that, and then in the montage he sees a kid, and Korg's narration is like, and he thought about what the future might entail, or something like that.
Right.
It's like, you get those two brief moments that kind of set up the idea that Thor maybe would want to be a dad, but that's it. It's like, if you're going to end it as him as an adoptive father, you gotta put some like juice in it, you know?
Let's talk about Thor's arc, such as it is. Because the general framing of it in the early scene with the Guardians of the Galaxy, who are just so wasted, is that this is like Thor midlife crisis moment. He is not in a bad place, but he's not in a good place. He's very like floating through the world, doesn't quite know what to do. He's got his glam rock look, which I was bummed. I kind of do like Thor's costume in the second half of this movie that looks like a fucking Power Rangers outfit, is kind of funny to me. But his fucking glam rock look with the red leather shirt and everything is so good. He should have just had that on the whole movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, the broad framing is that he's kind of wandering, doesn't know what to do, is unable to connect with people. You know, Chris Pratt gives him the whole speech about finding your person. And then he comes into contact with Jane again. And it's supposed to, again, the movie doesn't really do this, but broadly what it's trying to do is about Thor opening himself back up to love, which I don't know is actually a good read on who he was in Ragnarok or the Avengers movies or anything, but just for the sake of argument, that's what the movie's doing. He does it with Jane, but Jane is dying and there's nothing he can do, which there is a thematic thing they could have done there, that he's a god, but he can't save her, and but they don't go for any of that. So she just dies, but he doesn't, but the goal is not to close himself off to love. So by adopting the girl literally named Love, he proves that he is able to still love and go live a life. Broadly, I think if you fleshed in all of the steps along the way, that could work. I do think there's a problem in that I just don't think that's a good read on who Thor has been. But like, every step along the way, you can hear me struggling to describe it because the movie doesn't build up the scaffolding around that. You know?
Well, because like, the other problem is that has absolutely nothing to do with the whole other half of the movie, other than I guess that like Gore lost his kid too. So it's like, that's like the most it's connected, but like Gore's motivation is specifically about killing the gods, and Thor's hangups have nothing to do about him being a god, really. He doesn't engage with that question. His side of the movie isn't interested in the god stuff at all, and it feels like the natural arc from, like, if you're working from the perspective of he should be connected to Gore's whole deal more heavily, like, the natural connection would be that he needs to recognize his own fault within his godhood and then renounce his godhood or something like that. But that's just like the themes of Thor Ragnarok gussied up in slightly different clothing, right? Because that's exactly what his arc is in Thor Ragnarok. It's just there. It's not about godhood. It's about like being a member of an imperial state, right? And him having to recognize, oh, that I have perpetuated and benefited by the imperialism of Asgard, and I need to let that stuff go and embrace like the things that are actually important about our culture, and let go of the things that are like disastrous and poisonous about our culture. And so in Ragnarok, it all works because Thor's relationship with Hela and that dynamic is directly about what the movie is about. Whereas Thor's relationship to Gore the God Butcher is it doesn't exist at all. Like, he has no connection to it, either directly or thematically. And the most you can connect is that, like, these are both characters that have, like, lost people, but all the people that Thor has lost are from other movies that aren't really particularly relevant to the drama of this film. Until the end of the movie where he loses Jane, but that's at the end of the movie. So it's like that connection just does, no matter how you try to sort of square that circle, it cannot be squared within this movie.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so weird because the opening montage where you have Korg doing like the last time on Thor, basically,
Yeah.
is he shows like all the people Thor lost. And that actually is something you could go with because that was his arc in Endgame when he became, fat, sad Thor, is because everybody fucking died on him, including Loki and Heimdall killed in front of his eyes, and he failed and he's sad. Well, I think the natural next step would be to do a movie about Thor dealing with his feelings of that lack of power and all these people who died, and that he's kind of alone now. He doesn't have his brother. He doesn't have Heimdall. He's kind of disconnected from Asgard. That would be a good direction. The movie brings it up, but then never does it again because what it becomes about is Thor closing himself to love, which I don't think is what he had ever done. We didn't see him in a romance in Ragnarok or the Avengers movies, but he's Thor. He's open to people. He's good with people, like all of that. So I don't know what it's trying to be about. There is a great story to tell with Thor coming off of Endgame. We talked about that when we reviewed Endgame, that like the end of that movie, they've taken Captain America and Iron Man out of the picture. There's other heroes it feels like we don't ever need to see again. But Thor felt like, oh, he is still active and unsettled in interesting ways. Those active and interesting ways are not what they pick up on in Thor Love and Thunder, and that's what makes it feel... It also, I think, hamstrings Chris Hemsworth's whole performance, because it just becomes... The writing is mostly silly himbo Thor, which is funny. Chris Hemsworth is good at playing it, but it's not a character. He never has to reach deeper than that, which we know he can do very well.
Yeah, which he did in Thor Ragnarok. It's like...
And the Avengers movies, and yeah.
But it's just like specifically, it's that thing where like it hurts watching this movie because it's the same director, right? So it feels like, even though obviously this is not how movie production works, it's like complicated and hard and all that kind of stuff. But you sit there like being like, oh, this is the same guy who directed the last one, which is rare in Marvel. That you're getting that kind of like direct continuity in one of these side things, and it's like, and particularly one of like we're getting it's one of the best movies that they've made. And you're really hoping to get something that is like, it doesn't have to be as good as Thor Ragnarok, but something in the same ballpark. And then to get something that's like not even close to the same ballpark, like it's, it hasn't even left its house to drive to the same ballpark yet, is basically where Love and Thunder is. It's like, that's like the thing that gives you that very disappointing reaction. Because when we saw the trailer for this movie, it looked so good, and then like my warning lights started flashing immediately when it's like, oh shit, all the stuff I was excited about from this movie that was in the trailer is in the opening montage. And that's not like stuff in the plot of the movie. That's not spread out over the course of the movie. All like, because it was like exactly that thing with him, like with the red jacket and all of that. I was like, oh, it looks like they're doing cool stuff with the characters. Like, oh no, that's just the first 5 minutes, or like the first 5 minutes of his section of the movie after the prologue. I was like, oh fuck. As soon as I saw that, I kind of knew this is not going to be kind of what I was kind of hoping for based on the pedigree and the trailer for the film.
It is kind of amazing when you look back on it how little from like the last 90 minutes of the movie is in the trailers, right? Which Marvel generally does fewer trailers now for their movies because they don't have to, right? But it is still like, if you're only using the first 10 minutes of your movie in the trailer, that's usually probably a sign that the rest of the movie isn't that good. Mm-hmm. And I think you definitely get that here. The fucking Guardians of the Galaxy, that just so felt like something where Taika's like, God damn it, they stuck me with these fucking characters from the last movie, and I don't want to do anything with them, so let's get them off screen as quick as possible. Basically, Chris Pratt is the only one with a speaking role in the Guardians.
Which is weird because Thor's biggest relationship with any of them was with fucking Rocket in Endgame.
I know.
So it's like, I think Rocket says one line to Thor. I don't even think Thor says anything back.
It's a bummer. Like, I think after Endgame, what you and I wanted is some kind of like Guardians 3/Thor 4. I don't know. Like, I think there would have been a fun in-between movie to have with all of them together. And honestly, maybe that would be the right thing if Thor is in kind of an unsettled state, to let his next movie be a supporting character and have the Guardians be kind of in the driver's seat. Maybe there's something to do with that. But we wind up just, that's something that happened off screen and we'll never see. And that's a bummer because it seems like a fun character dynamic. But they're off to their next adventure. That felt like the bad version of like Marvel's crossover stuff of like, we set up a crossover, but we didn't actually want to do it, so goodbye. And just kind of just honestly, it means the beginning of this movie is needlessly protracted because they have to deal with this other set of characters, and it's a lot of shoe leather to get to nothing.
Yeah, especially because like the concept of the kind of what they suggest of like Thor is with the Guardians, and then he through his like connection to them, and they, you know, because they have gone on their adventures in their two movies of like becoming a family, that he learns from their experiences, and like that's like a catalyst for his own character growth is a great idea. And this movie sort of vaguely suggests that, but within like the clunkiest way possible, with the scene where Chris Pratt says all the stuff about you gotta, you know, look into the eyes of the people you love or whatever. And it's and you get the sort of like Hallmark greeting card of the themes of like that movie or something presented to you at the beginning of this film as a, hey, this is what this movie is going to sort of kind of be about with Thor, but not really. But we're not going to do any of the dramatic work to actually make you feel any of that stuff.
Yeah, no, totally. And you've got a sort of limp action sequence at the beginning. You quickly realize the visuals are an absolute nightmare, and then we move on to the Jane side of the story, which is the best thing in the movie.
Yes.
Because she's got an actual arc. It's a returning character. Natalie Portman's a great actress. And, you know, the idea of giving a Marvel character cancer, that's an interesting idea. That's a kind of thing we haven't dealt with in the MCU before. We don't really deal with it here. A little bit here and there. I love the whole idea that the hammer joins itself to her because Thor told it to protect her, right? And that's the backstory. There's so much sweet ideas there, but I don't even fully understand the mechanics of what's going on. That she gets the hammer and is super, but still dying of cancer, because like all of it is just kind of nonsense and goes nowhere. And then she dies, which feels wildly out of step with the movie that came before it.
Yeah, it's that thing of where I think, you know, there's a lot of things this movie could have done to try to kind of fix itself. And I think one of the biggest ones would have just had Jane be the lead character and have Thor be a supporting character in her movie. Which, you know, the movie's called Thor. And guess what? She's the mighty Thor. Like, this is a, you know, what they're doing with Jane is an adaptation of a comic run I'm familiar with but have not read. And I want to read it because I know it's really good. It's Jason Aaron's run on the Thor comics. Where he sort of did all the stuff with Jane, and she had cancer, and then she turns into the mighty Thor. And this is after our like classic Thor has like given up his power, and he's referred to as Odinson and not Thor anymore, which they don't really do in this movie. They kind of like gesture at in a couple of lines of dialogue as like references. But if they had done that and elevated Jane to the principal character, and the movie was fundamentally about her, and Thor, our Thor, the classic Thor, is like a supporting role in her movie, that would solve so many fucking problems. Like, because then Chris Hemsworth's character doesn't need to have a big character arc if he's the supporting character. He doesn't need it if he's not the protagonist. And so it would be fine if his whole dynamic was just seen through the relationship of like, how does he react to and respond to and connect to Jane as our protagonist. Like, you could absolutely do that. She's paired much more clearly with Gore the God Butcher. Even in the final movie, they do stuff to sort of parallel those characters. Obviously, the movie needs to do a lot more actual meaningful work with that, but that material is there. And that would be one thing that, like, I could imagine that version of this movie being great. Because Natalie Portman is fantastic. And her whole performance, balancing this, like, she's actually in a lot of pain, and she's actually dealing both like physical and psychological pain, and she's sort of hiding it up with this sort of weird, goofy version of superhero bravado she has observed from Thor, but doesn't actually have any of the like underpinnings that bravado comes from in Thor. I think she plays that so well, but you only get little brief flashes of it in the movie because she's not the main character.
Yeah, and I think this is also where I just wish there was more of the original Thor supporting cast here, because Ragnarok jettisoned most of it for, I think, good it worked in that movie very well because it helped that movie focus. But if you're gonna bring Jane in, I think we have Kat Dennings in one scene and we have Stellan Skarsgård in one scene, and that was nice. But I would have liked to see a little more of that, because that's the actual like support system around that character. And like, we don't really learn about like where her life is at this point. You know, like, she was a character who had a lot of import in those early Marvel Cinematic Universe films. So if you're a longtime fan of the films, you might want to learn a little bit more about that, and we don't really get that. It's very abstracted. And then her actual relationship with Thor, and this is the other problem, there's basically one major scene in the movie that actually like deals with it in an adult way, which is when they are on the ship with the best part of the movie, the goats, who are bleeding. And that is the funniest thing in the movie, is every time the goats bleed, because bleeding goats is always funny. But anyway, they're on the ship and they're like going through like the sea of eternity or whatever. And they have a talk about their relationship. And I'm just like, man, we fucked around for a really long time in Omnipotent City on nothing, when we could have been having the actual like romantic core of the movie here, but we didn't do that. That was a waste of time.
Yeah, because they basically have two scenes, right? Or if you don't count the montages, and it's that scene and then the scene where they're back in the hospital or whatever. It's like that's like the most like real character stuff you get between the two of them directly. And as you say, like it's something where it feels like you need a lot more of that, and there's a lot of weird, even though this movie isn't long, it's under 2 hours, like there's a lot of weird fat on this movie that you could cut and spend that time bolstering up this side of the movie that is actually important.
Well, because it barely has a plot.
Yeah.
The plot is that Gore is killing the gods. He kidnaps the Asgardian children to try to lure Thor out. And instead of just going directly to confront him, which is the next step in the plot, they decide to go to Omnipotent City to try to raise an army, which they don't do. All they get is the lightning bolt thing, which they don't really use that much. It doesn't like come in handy in like a key moment that like, it's just a thing Thor kind of fights him with for a little bit. And then they go and confront him. And that's the movie. Like it's barely got a story.
Yeah. And like the whole dynamics of the plot along the way are very confusing, because it is, because ultimately what Gore needs is he needs Thor's axe, Stormbreaker, in order to open up the Bifrost, which is the key to get access to the Eternal, which is like, and so that's a thing you find out when they visit the space shadow dimension, is that like the Stormbreaker is the key to the Eternal. You find out that Gore isn't just killing the gods, but he actually wants access to the Eternal, what the Eternal is, at Omnipotent City. That's the only like useful piece of information to the plot that is delivered in Omnipotent City, which is like, that is a lot of bullshit to put in a sequence in order to get that piece of information. That feels like that's information you could have established at the beginning of the film, and had that be like, oh, we know that this is what he's trying to do. Not like just he's going around stabbing people with a sword, but that he's going to access the magic wish-granting god at the center of the universe and use that god to get rid of the other gods or whatever. Like that's a lot of weird, very specific, convoluted information to present like 2/3 of the way through your movie about how the actual content of the villain's plan is. It just feels like if you're watching a spy movie or something, and at the beginning of the movie you're like, oh, this guy's going to like, there's a guy who's assassinating some people, and then you find out like 30 minutes before the end of the movie that no, he's not assassinating people, he's actually said like blowing up a nuclear bomb. It's like, why isn't this movie about he stole a nuclear bomb? Like, why isn't that what the fucking plot of the film is? What was all this shit about like weird assassinations or whatever that we spent an hour on, and then that's not actually what it's about. It's not about him going and stabbing people with his magic death sword. It's about him getting a wish-granting demon, devil, eternal, whatever fucking thing. It's such a weird choice to do it that way.
Yeah, which, and as you know, as soon as they introduce the idea of the Eternal, or the, what is it? Is it the Eternal?
I think it's the Eternal is what they call it.
Okay. Because then there's also or it's the Eternity, because the Eternals are the characters in the bad movie. So once you introduce that, my immediate thought was, oh, that's how they're going to save Jane at the end of the movie, is make the wish on the Eternity. They don't. That's not inherently a bad thing. That could be a good version of like needs versus wants. They want Jane to live, but they find a bigger need that they all agree on at the end. But of course the movie does not earn that. I mean, part of the whole problem of ending this with Thor raising a little girl is that the little girl was dead the whole movie and had no relationship with anyone until the scene where she is now Thor's daughter. That's a bad idea. I don't feel like I need to explain that just from a narrative standpoint. It's weird. Yeah, like you don't have any investment in that relationship in any way, because you can't. No. I mean, the little girl was on screen for like 2 minutes at the beginning of the movie and starved to death. And has remained starved to death for the entire running time of the rest of the film. Okay, I do want to talk about the gods.
Yes.
what the fuck are gods?
They're aliens.
And
They're magical
okay,
aliens.
they're magical aliens. Okay? Marvel, have you seen Eternals yet?
No.
Okay. Eternals, and again, I'm not a continuity stickler, but Marvel wants you to be a continuity stickler because they have this whole fucking big interconnected continuity. So goddamn it, I'm going to do it. Eternals, I watched all 75 hours of that very long movie, which had a lot, and I mean a lot, of exposition about how the Eternals are not actually gods. They're from the, like, Watchers or something, create the Eternals and send them out, but the Eternals are the inspiration for all the Earth gods. They get really deep into this in that movie, that there's, like, a character named Icarus who is the inspiration in ancient Greece for the actual Icarus myth. And they have, like, Circe is the myth for Circe. All these gods, like, they do it for all the characters, is an inspiration for an actual god.
Yes, it's the plot of, like, 5 episodes of the original series of Star Trek. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. There's a ton of those, but that's what
Exactly,
Eternals is a 3-hour movie that spends a lot of time expositing this. Then, 3 or 4 movies later, however many it's been, Thor, Love, and Thunder, there are actual gods. It's not just like the Asgardians are a society where there's Thor and he's powerful. There are gods. Something makes them divine. I don't know what makes them divine, but there's a separation between aliens who have these powers and aliens who don't. There are divine gods, and there is a Zeus who must have some relation to Earth Zeus, but then what is Icarus and what are the Eternals? Completely all fucking broken. I mean, also, Eternals made it clear that Thanos was a god, because Thanos is one of the Eternals, is the reveal at the end of that movie. I'm confused by all of it. None of it makes sense. It feels like one hand of Marvel is not talking to the other, and I don't know what they are, and I want him to kill the gods, because the gods in this movie are annoying, and the gods in Eternals were annoying. I want them all to die.
All the gods are magical space aliens that happen to have a very striking resemblance to figures from Earth culture and religion, in a very similar way to how Rocket Raccoon just happens to be a space alien that looks exactly like a raccoon. But he's not a raccoon can't be because he's not from Earth. It is the exact same thing. We want them to be gods, but we can't actually have them be gods because we've got too much other shit going on, because it's like this weird big multi-genre styled universe. So in some things you kind of treat them vaguely like gods, but ultimately at the end of the day they are just magical space aliens.
Okay, but they all have a relationship because the sword can destroy them and they hang out in a city together. Yeah. What makes them gods?
Magic. Space
like
aliens.
Superman has god powers on Earth because of our yellow sun and the
Yes.
difference in atmosphere and all that. That's easy to understand. That's also the explanation in Eternals and all this stuff. What is Zeus? None of it makes sense. It doesn't really matter, but I'm thinking about this because the scene is so bad.
Omnipotent City is a city on an alien planet, not in a, like, another dimension. Right,
but there are other dimensions, because there's the eternity that is like God granting wishes.
No, that's just the center of the universe that is locked behind a gate that you can only open with. And let's ignore the fact that the universe isn't a thing that can have a center, because that's not the way that space-time works. But people use that expression a lot, and that's just what they say.
But there's an afterlife. We learned in the last scene of the movie. There is Valhalla. What's Valhalla?
That is actually another dimension. That's not an alien planet, because that's what happens when you die.
Okay, this is all utter fucking gibberish, is what you're telling me. That's fine.
The Bifrost is just a wormhole. But it is also a magical wormhole that works as a key that gives you access to the center of the universe that can't exist, where there's a thing called eternity that grants you a wish, because because eternity is also a magic space alien that's very magical.
Getting back to Zeus, the idea, when we saw it was Russell Crowe, I actually laughed for a second. I'm like, oh, this will be fun. Then he opened his mouth and started talking. What is going on with Russell Crowe in this movie? Did the people in the movie find it funny? And why is so much of the movie about that?
I don't know what they're trying to do. I mean, I know that it's like a Greek accent, so it's like whatever.
It's theoretically a Greek accent.
I think, for me, the big thing with Zeus and all that stuff is it feels like it's just from another movie that is trying to do the more Thor Ragnarok-ish plot with this, where Thor, like, realizes that being a god is bad and renounces his godhood. And there's, like, a couple of moments where you have that brief flicker of where, is this a thing that the movie's trying to do? And then it's like, I guess not. But, like, that whole sequence is just bizarre, where they go there to go raise an army of gods, and then Zeus says like one sentence, and he says something about like, oh, we're gonna have an orgy, and we're gonna have, you know, a contest or whatever to see who has like had the most mortal sacrificed to them. And then immediately they hear that and like, oh, we're not gonna get an army of gods, but we're gonna steal his lightning bolt. It's like, what? Like, where did that come from? What does that have to do with anything? Like, why did you give up on this plan immediately with no pushback, no resistance? You didn't, it's not like well, he's a bad, maybe there are other good gods that we can convince, or like maybe Zeus is just the asshole. There's no like Thor doesn't have any soul searching of where, you know, he says all this stuff about like, oh, I modeled my whole thing off of Zeus. And it's like kind of a funny idea and a funny line about like, he's the god of lightning, I'm the god of thunder. I like that bit, but that feels like the setup to like a character arc, not just a one punchline joke where it's like, oh no, actually Zeus is an asshole, guess you never should meet your heroes. But it feels like that's supposed to be the setup to Thor doesn't realize and doesn't see that Zeus is an asshole, and then goes into like tries to actually convince Zeus, and he thinks that Zeus is on his side, but actually like Zeus is like a betraying prick or whatever, you know, like a character arc you've seen in a million movies. It's basically like what Guardians 2 is about. Like, but it's like that feels like they are setting up that, and then they just jettison it immediately. They don't then try to raise an army of gods in any other way, and they for some reason decide that stealing the lightning bolt is going to be a very important thing that they really should spend all this energy and effort doing, even though you as the audience are not given any clear reason for why. Is this lightning bolt somehow better than the two magical hammers that you already own? Like, is it good against gore in some way? Does it counteract the necro sword? Why do you want this lightning bolt? The answer to that question is that they don't. It isn't useful. It's like just another weapon that's used in the other action scenes, but not for any specific plot purpose. And then ultimately, secretly, actually what all of this shit is about is having Zeus deliver the line about, like, oh, he will never reach the eternity. It's like, he's trying to reach the eternity, and that's it. That's what all of that shit was about, was getting that one piece of fucking exposition delivered to our protagonist, and it is an insufferable, awful, terrible scene. That is one of the clunkiest pieces of plotting I maybe have ever seen in, like, a big movie like this.
The lightning bolt is like this purely backwards utilitarian thing where Thor gets his axe Stormbreaker stolen by Gore. So going into the final action scene, he doesn't have a weapon because they took Stormbreaker and Jane has Mjolnir. So he's gonna need a third weapon, but he doesn't know that an hour earlier in the movie, and neither do we. It's complete backwards writing.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing where it's like the problem of, oh, Thor doesn't have Stormbreaker, how he's going to stop Gore the God Butcher, is way more interesting when the answer to that question isn't, oh, well, we happened to steal a magic lightning bolt at the middle point of the movie for no good reason. Like, there's so many ways that, oh god, I don't have my big crazy magic axe hammer thing. How do I stop this? Either he has to use Mjolnir, and then Jane is able to turn into Thor without Mjolnir. That would be a rad anime-ass thing that could have happened at the end of this movie. Or Thor doesn't have a magic weapon, gets the Valkyrie's horse or whatever, you know, they've got a million ways that they can get there. Like, how they travel around the universe and all that shit is so fucking loose in this movie that it's like, at a certain point, you just give up on the logic and reasoning behind any of it because it's so thin. Like, I don't know at what point it was like clearly established that Thor's hammer is like the new Bifrost and can just do that without anything else, and all that shit.
It wasn't. That was never established.
Yeah, like I think he does that in Avengers Infinity War, but that's just like a cool scene and not like this is a clear thing that's been communicated to the audience that is important about this hammer. But if like Thor had to find a way and he gets to where Gore is and has to fight him without his magic hammer, and then that's what leads him to being like, oh, I will like bestow my godly power with the kids and fight with the kids, which is an idea I love, but is one of the many things in this movie that is not appropriately set up or like worked through. It's very sudden that he shares his godly power with the kids, and it's also very disappointing that the kids don't magically get a bunch of literally cute little kid Thor costumes, which is absolutely what should have happened in that movie. They should have made 100 little tiny kid costumes. But like, if that's like what he did, and he gives up his godly power and bestows it to them, and here is his army of gods. Like, this is the thing. Like, there's so many ideas in the movie. All those pieces are really interesting, and it's got all those pieces at his fingertips. But the answer it comes to is, I actually already have a magic lightning bolt, and I can just get there, and I'm just going to give the kids godly powers without any cost to myself. Thor doesn't seem to be disempowered in any way by doing that. And we're just going to have the big final action scene without any of, like, the risk or reward or, like, consequence or any growth demonstrated through any of this, because all the bumps in the plot have been either shaved over or ignored to just get to the scene that you wanted to have.
Here's the thing, though. What you're describing, Thor Ragnarok, is a movie about Thor having a cool hammer. It gets destroyed, and then he doesn't have a cool hammer. And the climax of the movie is him seeing Odin in the afterlife going, well, are you the god of hammers? What are you the god of? He's the god of thunder, and he has his thunder powers, and it's cool.
Yeah.
And there's something really frustrating about everything post-Thor Ragnarok with Thor for me, where Thor Ragnarok has him lose the hammer, lose an eye. He's very different at the end of that movie, and they have been working so fucking hard to reverse all of that since then. So Infinity War, he gets a new eye, doesn't have to have the eye patch anymore, and then he gets instead of a hammer, he gets a cool axe, and he gets to use that. And that's fine for what it is, but it is a complete, like, we're going to reverse what Thor Ragnarok did. And then this movie, if you are just looking at it purely mercenary, Jane's whole role in this movie is to come back, reforge Mjolnir, and then die so Thor can have Mjolnir again, and the status quo is restored at the end of the movie. Like, there's something about all of that that's very disappointing, which is that Thor, I guess, never actually learned anything from Ragnarok. He just got all the stuff back and is fine now. It's very weird in that way.
It is one of, like, the many things about, like, the MCU at this point that it is fascinating as a fan of American superhero comic books to see, like, this whole journey where we are now at this point with the MCU, where it has been going on long enough that it has adopted all of, like, the bad shit from its source material, in the sense of, like, that one of the things about American superhero comic books is that there is some sort of vague, nebulous gravity to the, like, whatever the core of the thing is. And as of, like, the premise of the character, where there's Spider-Man, Thor, Iron Man, Captain America. And unless there's, like, a huge seismic shift that can happen, that almost never happens with any of, like, the actual big long-running characters, nothing can escape the gravity of whatever that core is. And the further you get away from it, the more harsh the whiplash is going to be when eventually some editor is at the comic book company is going to say, nah, Spider-Man can't be married, because Spider-Man wasn't married for this stretch of time, and we want him to go back to whatever vague sort of core Spider-Man that is kind of like college years Spider-Man, that is kind of what Marvel Comics wants Spider-Man to always kind of be. Eventually they will find some rope to tug on and yank that character back to that core. So Thor, the thing with Thor is that, like, he always has to go back to being an arrogant prick. It always has to happen, because it's, like, the defining character flaw that Thor has as a character. So in this happens in the comic books all the time, where, like, eventually he, like, reaches some state of enlightenment, he gives up being Thor or whatever, and he, like, reaches that plateau, and then eventually an editor or another writer gets put on the series, or something happens, and they're like, yeah, but I read the comics where Thor was an arrogant prick and then overcame being an arrogant prick, and I want to tell my version of that story. So now we're going to return Thor to being an arrogant prick in a slightly different way, so we can have him overcome it in a slightly different way. And it's like, at this point, 29 movies and fucking God knows how many years now at this point, into like 14, 15 years into the Marvel thing, they are absolutely at the point where you are doing the exact same thing. As soon as the character diverges just too far away from whatever that center point is, it has to be yanked back, because there are too many hands on the wheel, and there's too much of a sort of cultural mindset around who the character is at their core, that once you start to diverge from it, it has to be pulled back.
Yeah, I think that's true. At least they haven't, I guess, reset his characterization. It's more the aesthetics around him. But it's still, I don't know, Thor Ragnarok suggested something very different, and that's not what we're getting. Yes. So, yeah, that's disappointing. I want to have a bigger conversation about the MCU in general in a little bit. A couple of things I want to hit on first. One is, the end credits scene in this is awful.
I didn't
not the last
see
one.
the last one. I didn't stay that long.
Oh, okay.
I didn't
The
like the movie enough to
the very last one is good. That's it's Jane arrives in
Yeah.
Valhalla and Heimdall, played by Idris Elba, greets her. I liked that. That's a nice little moment. It breaks my head a little bit with now the afterlife canonically exists, but that's fine. It's good.
I saw that through cell phone footage, but I
That's
did not.
fine.
Yeah, I didn't sit through the whole credits. For
yeah.
it.
So the mid-credits sequence is the one where we get Zeus introducing his son Hercules,
Right, yes.
played by Brett Goldstein. And this is a trend that has developed in Phase 4 Marvel that is driving me fucking crazy, which is that the post-credits scenes now are not about introducing a cool character in the way like Iron Man is we meet Nick Fury. And Nick Fury was a recognizable actor, but the thrill of that scene wasn't just it's Samuel L. Jackson, it's that it's S.H.I.E.L.D., it's Nick Fury, it's the Avengers, right? Now it is, what celebrity are we introducing to play a character you've never fucking heard of? And all of the Phase 4 movies are doing this. Black Widow ends, its post-credit scene is with Julia Louis-Dreyfus playing some character who then showed up in Falcon and the Winter Soldier and all that. Shang-Chi didn't do this. Eternals did it with Mahershala Ali, off-screen voicing Blade, but he's unidentified. The only way you will understand the end of Eternals is if you can recognize Mahershala Ali's voice without seeing his body, and you have read the news that they are making a Blade movie. That's how the only way you will understand Eternals. Spider-Man No Way Home doesn't do it, to its credit. Doctor Strange does it with Charlize Theron, and it's Charlize Theron's going to be in Marvel playing a character you've never heard of and don't know who she is. Thor Love and Thunder, I guess we know Hercules technically, but the joke of that scene is that it's Brett Goldstein from Ted Lasso, and it's completely dependent on you having seen Ted Lasso, because that's what he's from, and that's the joke, is that it's Brett Goldstein who plays this very angry character on Ted Lasso being Hercules. It's a completely outside of the diegesis of Thor joke. Several of the MCU series over on Disney Plus have done this. It's driving me crazy. It's terrible. They need to stop.
To be fair to this one, I don't know who that actor is because I've never watched Ted Lasso. But I have read the Marvel comics where Hercules popped up because he is like, of the like mythological hero characters, it's like Thor is number one, and then they do have a very long running version of Hercules that has been a hero in Marvel comics. So like that was the thing I looked at. It's like, yeah, that's Hercules. It's not like I wasn't excited by it. I don't think it's a good scene or anything, but that was where I was like, that looks like the Hercules costume from the Marvel comics.
Because also, like, nothing's coming out of any of these end credit scenes, really. Maybe at some point, but also maybe not. Because the MCU has been going on long enough that I can point to all of the various end credit scenes that went nowhere because the next person who came in to do the movie didn't want to do anything with it, you know?
Yeah.
Like, Thor Ragnarok actually handles this pretty well, but consider like Thor 2, The Dark World, ends with the whole thing of Loki taking over Asgard secretly. When it came down to Thor Ragnarok, Taika Waititi didn't want to make that movie. So they have fun with it. They do a good version of Loki just hasn't done anything. He's been sitting on his ass, and they turn it into a character thing for Loki. But it is something that movie has to deal with when it did not, like, that's just a plan they dropped that no one else wanted to play with. And they keep doing that all the time in these movies, and it's annoying.
Yeah. The post-credit stuff is particularly like, it was good when it was like the Avengers, and you're like, oh, the Avengers is a thing popular enough that enough people are going to know what, like, when he says, like, oh, the Avengers Initiative, enough people in the audience are going to be like, oh, I watched an Avengers cartoon when I was 5 or whatever. Right. And it was like that, or when it was just like a dumb gag, and that's as far as it went, and that's usually what they still save, like the post-credit scenes usually are just the dumb gags. But yes, it has been a long thing at this point where MCU post-credit scenes have been very tedious and useless.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing. Frankly, to me, the worst thing about this movie is a visual train wreck. What the fuck is going on with Marvel's effects? And not just their effects, but the entire pipeline of visualization. Because this movie, this has been going on more and more with Marvel in that they've become more and more studio bound over the years. And some of this in recent movies is the COVID effect, but not entirely, because Doctor Strange was also a COVID production that kind of dodged a lot of, at least some of this, because Sam Raimi was skillful enough to dodge some of it. But Spider-Man No Way Home and now this movie both have this thing where even for scenes where you could build a set or go to a location or just like visualize it more fulsomely, they wind up shooting everything on a green screen, or in this movie's case, most of it, my understanding, and you can kind of see it, is in front of the volume, which is the stagecraft technology where it's big LCD or LED screens that are showing digital effects behind them. And what it winds up turning into, and I think No Way Home had a lot of this, but this movie has it way worse, is that I never feel like the actors are in a location. I never get an illusion that they are in any of these spaces. All it is, the movies become very flat. And what it feels like persistently throughout Thor Love and Thunder is that they are not in New Asgard. They are not on that planet at the beginning with the Guardians. They are not in Omnipotent City. They are not in the Shadow Realm. They are not in wherever they are. They are on a set in Atlanta, Georgia. Actually, I think this one's shot in New Zealand. But they are on a set, they are on a soundstage somewhere, and they are standing in front of things. And all of Thor Love and Thunder is actors shot in medium close-up, standing in front of things. They are never interacting with those things. We are never moving through that space. There honestly aren't that many camera moves in this movie. Yeah. I remember I was kind of shocked when you get to Omnipotent City and you get inside the big dome arena where Zeus is talking. They do a big 360 camera spin to show off the digital set. And that is the most elaborate camera move in this entire movie. Because the rest of the movie is people standing in front of these spaces, but we never go into those spaces. We never get a sense of geography or spatial reasoning of well, this character is here in this location in relation to this character. They're all just standing in front of nondescript backgrounds. One of the limitations of the stagecraft technology is that to make it work, you usually do it with a soft focus background. And if you are the Batman or the Mandalorian shot by Greg Fraser, who is a genius who invented this, you can use that really, really effectively. If you are this movie and it's just every scene, then also none of those locations have any visual identity because they all have to be uniformly in soft focus because that's how the stagecraft volume stuff works. So you never get a real sense for what these places are. You never get a sense that these characters are inside these spaces. There's no geography whatsoever. Honestly, it reminds me of, on our 10th anniversary podcast, Sean, you and I and my brother Thomas talked about Persona 3, The Weird Masquerade.
Yes.
And what it does is that's a stage show where they are on stage and there's a big TV behind them and or a projection or something, a big screen, and it shows locations from the game and they stand in front of it. And for a stage play, that's a kind of cool thing to do. For a $250 million movie, it looks like cheap fucking shit. And that's every frame of Thor Love and Thunder looks like Persona 3, The Weird Masquerade.
Yeah, and because I think it's a very interesting from a more technical perspective looking at it, because it is the worst use of the volume that we have seen so far, or at least I've seen in any movie, because it's still fairly new technology, so it hasn't been used in a huge amount of stuff yet. And so it's very educational, and it's interesting to see how it looks bad use of the volume looks terrible, but it looks terrible in ways that are very different than bad usage of green and blue screen,
yes.
Which is what we've gotten from a lot of recent Marvel stuff, which is just really bad compositing and really bad use of green screen versions of digital replacements of environments. That is kind of what that No Way Home look. But this, I think the Persona 3 thing is the exact thought that I had as well. Because I think it becomes clear when you watch this movie that, when done poorly, the volume is stagecraft is a super hyper technically advanced version that is much more versatile technically. But if you don't use its versatility, it's pointless. But much more technologically advanced version of old school rear projection, which old school rear projection is this is what that Persona 3 thing is, and it's a thing that some stage shows will do, but it also was done in old films, is you just have a screen and you put a projector behind the screen and project an image, a mirror image of what you want onto the screen from behind it, because if it's a mirror image from behind, on the front it will resolve the right way around from what you want it to be. And so if you watch lots of old movies, and particularly when people have driving scenes, but they're not actually driving a car, really, right? They're on a set with a prop car and the camera's in the car or on the car. You would need a moving background, right? You can't have a matte painting like evoke the sense of movement you need. You want a moving image, and so you use rear projection because it allows you to project some footage you shot, or you have stock footage of like a desert driving, like going past the car or whatever. And you use rear projection, and it's like a thing that old movies did all the time. And some of it can look super cheap and bad, but in ways that like reminds me a lot of what this movie looks like, which is like how bad and weird the lighting is, and how much it just feels like you said about them standing in front of a screen. Because even with bad like green screen and blue screen stuff, I still think like, and it might have to do with some of the focus thing you're talking about, it still usually feels like there's more depth to the image you're seeing. Yes, there is. Than like the stagecraft thing, which like you can, when it's lit poorly and they're not using it and shooting it well, like it feels like you're losing the sense of depth you could get from green screen, or that you can also get if the volume stuff is done very well, like in the Batman, which does it fucking probably the best of anything we've seen. And I think a big problem is like the lighting. Everything is so flatly universally lit. There's no sense of like thought or like artistry to the way that a scene is lit that uses the volume to sort of assist the lighting and like give a like visual logic to how things are being lit in a dramatic sense, which is like one of those things that the Batman does. And so like the Batman picks like really like stark dramatic lighting scenarios to use the volume with, and then supplements the natural lighting you get from the LEDs with studio lights that but are all planned, and it's all like, you know, having good pre-production of knowing this is exactly the lighting that we want that fits the digital environment we have created for this sequence of shots. And this feels like there was no planning done on it, and it's like, let's just light it the fuck up. Let's make everything as like bright and flatly lit as possible. And that just like exposes how much they are just standing in front of a very fancy screen that has like a very nice video game world behind them, but that's all it feels like. And it just feels like you spent a hell of a lot of money to get a very fancy version of rear projection in your movie.
Well, yeah, and a couple of notes on that. One, I mean, that lighting technique, that is just Marvel's general MO at this point, and with green screen, it's bad, but you can at least like adjust the background somewhat to them. If you're doing it all on set with the volume, you're just fine. That's the image, you're fucked. Yeah. So that's a problem. The thing about rear projection, you're right, and one similarity it has is that rear projection will also usually go for a soft focus effect. Mm-hmm. And to make it like a background, and what the illusion is that it is a foreground is in focus and background is in soft focus, which is a common cinematographic technique. But, you know, there is no movie, to my knowledge, that is 100% rear projection, where most of the movie, it would be ridiculous. And you mentioned the car thing. That's the thing. Rear projection was almost always used when there was some kind of like artifice between them, like they're in a car or they're on a trolley, like in Take Me to St. Louis, or Meet Me in St. Louis would be one that does that, where they're on a trolley scene, you know, anything like that. It's not just like, there's very few examples, I think, of two people just standing in front of a rear projection. Yeah, because
there's not usually much reason to, like, there might be like very specific special effects reasons, like King Kong used some rear projection stuff, like in very creative ways. But generally speaking, in a scenario where you don't need to have a moving image as the background and you're on like a set, you would just use traditional stagecraft, like actual stagecraft, like paintings and like set dressing and stuff like that to create a background and not project a moving image onto the back of it. Yeah, this movie is just Marvel's normal, like, unimaginative lighting, where it feels like it's just a setting in the studio that no one is allowed to play with. And then it is all in front of the big LCD screens instead of in front of green screens. The worst scene, I think, in this regard in this movie is the big action scene in New Asgard, where inexplicably, instead of having a set outside that they went and shot in with extras and all of this stuff, all of the close-ups on actors, and even some of the non-close-ups, are them standing in front of either a green screen composite or a stagecraft projection of the action going on behind them. So like when Thor and Jane are talking, they're not in New Asgard, they're on the set with the New Asgard stuff being projected behind them. It's absolutely baffling that you would not like go shoot that scene outside in reality and build, because they did have to build some of it, because there are scenes where they're walking through that set. It's a location. But then
they're just, that one is just like out of this world. What are we looking at? And you get that also again in the scene where they're in the council, where they're in the building. It's the one where Thor makes the hole in the roof and all of that. And there's also some shots in that where it's clear, and maybe this is a reshoot thing, I don't know, but you have like Natalie Portman, because this scene has even been making the rounds on Twitter because it's in one of the clips they put out, where just clearly she's not in the room. The room is a soft focus projection behind her. I've never seen anything like that.
So I think that specific scene you're talking about is a reshoot, because I had a YouTube clip floated up in my algorithm or whatever yesterday that was Taika Waititi and Tessa Thompson. I think it's like Variety, it's whatever, like some like a publication with a YouTube channel does these scenes where they get directors or actors to break down a scene from their movie, and some of them are pretty interesting. And I saw that one from them, and I'm like, wait, is that scene where they're just like talking in that building? Why would this be a scene that you would have, like, there's nothing going on, this is a terrible scene for this movie? Because I saw it from the thumbnail and I clicked on it, and I would recommend people watch it because it is like seeing people held hostage, Taika Waititi and Tessa Thompson, trying to talk positively about the scene that is clearly really bad. And they say that it was a reshoot, that they had to reshoot it later because if there was like plot or whatever, something changed and we had to do this reshoot. But it is that scene of them in the town hall talking, and it's just like super bad clunky dialogue, really heavy exposition. Yeah, and like Natalie Portman fucking flies out of the scene for no reason and then comes back later for no reason other than that, like, she was presumably not there for one part of the filming of the reshoots or whatever the fuck was going on. And it is a fascinating video to see, like, clearly it feels like they know that it's not a good scene and that they're frustrated with it, but they can't be critical about the movie they're promoting. So if you look at, like, Google for it or look up on YouTube, you can probably find it, and it was interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's a disaster. This movie cost $250 million, and the only money I can account for on screen is that Chris Hemsworth is a pretty expensive actor at this point, and Natalie Portman and Christian Bale are too. And that's it. You cannot see the money on screen in this movie. It's like the anti-Dune in that regard, right? Like Dune, whatever else you think about it, you look at that movie and you're like, that's an expensive, cool-looking movie.
Yeah.
Not this. Nope. This has taken the crown from Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, the fourth Pirates movie, as the cheapest-looking Hollywood production I've ever seen.
Yeah, and it's something for me of where, like, you know, like the No Way Home stuff, like it bothered me a bit, but it didn't annoy me that much because it looked bad in the ways I kind of like had gotten used to from recent Marvel productions. So it's like I was kind of able to look past it a lot more than you did. But this one, because it looks bad in this very different way, I'm like not accustomed to being able to just kind of like ignore some of it. So it's like this one in particular, I was like, this does not work. And it's like it's more interesting the ways it looks bad to me than the ways that No Way Home looks bad, which just look very sort of like standard bad for a modern production. This is like, oh my god, they do not know how to use the volume and all this new technology at all, and so it is just absolutely disastrous. But it's a disaster you've never seen before, as opposed to a disaster you've seen a million of, which is kind of like with the visual style of No Way Home. And so that's like some kind of recommendation for this movie is if you're curious, like it would make a fascinating double feature, the Batman and this, just looking at like the way they use that technology. Because I think even in the Batman, there are moments where you can, I think, kind of feel some of the limitations of the volume that they have to struggle against, but like it still gives them a lot of very tangible advantages that they use really effectively. Because like with anything, this technology is a tool that filmmakers use. If they use it well, it's amazing. If they use it poorly, it sucks. But like as with any tool, it's going to have like its pluses and minuses on what it can and cannot do. And it is like the contrast between the Batman and this are so stark in how they're able to use that technology effectively.
And the other thing about the Batman, when we talk about limitations, they're self-imposed limitations. Like the Batman is consciously a studio movie that is not meant to look real. It has an artifice a la the film noir movies that it is pulling from. And so, like, there's a reason why every time they're on that rooftop set of the constructed building with the, you know, Gotham skyline behind them, that's an obvious use of the volume, but it's obvious in the same way a good matte painting is. That's the entire idea of those scenes. And also, the Batman has tons of scenes that are just sets and are extras and are all sorts of things. Like, it's scene to scene, shot to shot, decisions are being made. Batman also cost between 180 and 200 million, somewhere in there. So at least $50 million less, and is an hour longer and looks much better. I at a certain point, I am wondering who is laundering money through the MCU to make the budgets that high. There's cocaine is going somewhere to someone.
Yeah, because, yeah, 'cause, like, with the tool metaphor, like, the MCU is, like, a very good example of, like, the modern version of the MCU, because it wasn't like this before. Like, if you go back and watch the older movies, they had their issues in some of, like, the way they looked. Like, they weren't, like, the best made movies of all time, but they looked like a good blend of CG and practical effects and actual sets and on-film location shooting and stuff like that. But, like, modern MCU stuff is very much the, like, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail thing, of where if the only thing you can do is use green screen, or if the only thing you can do is use the volume, like, every single problem you encounter in filmmaking is like, well, we'll solve it with this. We'll just, like, we'll let them do it in post, or this is what we've done in pre-production, because with the volume, obviously there's stuff you'll do in post. Post-production still exists, but part of the point of the volume is for those scenes, you do a lot of what used to be post-production digital work and do it as pre-production digital work, so that you can do it and film it on set that day, because it's actually what you're shooting with your camera. But, like, whatever of those two poisons you're picking, every single scene effectively feels like that is how you've approached the problem of how do we film this sequence, is with our green screen stuff or with our volume stuff. And so every single scene looks the same, and some stuff can, like, be fine with it. There are certain moments where it's like, well, this is okay, but there are lots of sequences where it's like, this was not the way to do this. And the Batman has a bunch of tools in its tool chest of how to shoot different kinds of sequences for things that are, like, efficient and appropriate for the kind of scene it is. And, like, the MCU has had this problem for a while, but there's something about the fresh new way that Thor: Love and Thunder looks bad that made it really stand out to me in a way that I didn't have as much of a problem with before.
Did you have the trailer for Avatar 2 before your movie? Yeah. And that's been before pretty much every Disney release, for good reason. It's their big holiday release, and it's Disney and all that, right? So corporate synergy. I think in a certain sense, they maybe need to stop showing that in front of their new movies, because Avatar 2 looks like some of the best visual effects I've ever seen in my life. It's just in that 2-minute trailer. And then it, like, just in fucking comparison, makes the Marvel movie of the day look even fucking worse, because Avatar 2 is doing, like, just in those, like, 90 seconds of footage, every single shot has, like, camera movement and is doing dynamic things with lighting, and it's, like, very three-dimensional back into the, like, depths of the image. There's that one shot where it's one of the Na'vi on, like, a whale going through the water, and the camera spins in and out of the water with them, and all this stuff where it's just your jaw drops, and it feels like the Avatar 2 trailer dropped out of an alternate dimension, where instead of from 2009 to now, CGI got worse and worse and worse, which is what has happened since Avatar 1. Yeah. It got better and better and better, and Avatar 2 looks like, and I know people love to rag on Avatar, I'm not saying it's going to be like the best story ever, but it's an objectively amazing looking trailer, and it feels like from a completely different world of visual effects than we've been getting in recent years.
Well, I mean, it's effectively an animated, like, it's almost all computer effects,
but
right? But, like,
yes and no. It's like a lot of it is, like, there's a shot where it's all of them on the ocean and the camera is, like, bobbing with them in the water. And I know that that is an actual shot of the ocean, because so much of what they did was to figure out how to do mocap underwater and to have those abilities. So a lot of it is CGI, but it's also built on actual principles of, like, cinematography and how things interact with the world. And I'm just saying that that's, like, another level of, like, effort that's been put into it. James Cameron knows how to shoot a movie where every scene is going to have, like, a polished look to it. And as you say, with Marvel, it's just all they have is the hammer, and that's it.
Yeah, well, I think, like, the thing I was going to say with the Avatar 2 thing is, like, it's effectively more or less an animated movie. Obviously, there are real people in it, and you see it in some of the shots, and I'm sure that there are, like, some real elements and stuff that they do, maybe with some of the water stuff. But by and large, it's mostly, like what the original Avatar was, it is mostly a CGI animated film. Just done to, like, a crazy high degree of realism in terms of the effects they're able to achieve. And what's, like, particularly, like, impressive and weird in the, like, contrast is that the, like, really impressive super high detail realistic effects they do for their fake, like, 8-foot tall blue alien people. Those blue alien people look more real to me than the actual Chris Hemsworth shot with an actual camera, because of all the fuckery going on around it. Like, Chris Hemsworth so doesn't look like he fits into the environment he shot on that he himself starts to look fake. Like, it's one of the, it's like when they did the fucking Matrix Unreal Engine 5 thing, and it was like, can you tell the difference between a fake Keanu Reeves that we made with our thing or the real Keanu Reeves shot with an actual camera? It was like, and you could definitely tell, but there was like a thing of, so much of it is, does the image have a consistency to it? And does like everything feel like it fits in? Because it's like, if you can shoot this digital person and make them feel like they exist in a realistic looking environment, that will convince you that the digital person looks fairly real, or is like the best thing you can do. Whereas if you shoot an actual person, but they look like they're standing in a fake environment, the actual person looks like they're fake because everything looks fake.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I would be prepared to bet that there's more live action photography going on in the original Avatar than in Thor: Love and Thunder. There's enough of that movie that is on sets.
In terms of like percentage of what you are visually seeing in the image, like almost.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
And because at this point, Thor: Love and Thunder, the only real things are some of the actors. Even some of their costumes are CGI at this point. You know, like, remember in Avengers Infinity War, like, they have those white and red costumes that are completely CGI because they decided to add it after they finished the movie. And that looks fine because it's only for a couple of shots, but like, it's a consistent thing now, and it's like more expensive than just going out and building a fucking set is what drives me crazy about it, you know? Yeah. So what about the MCU writ large? Maybe this is a bigger conversation than we can have right now, but like, what's so weird is that there's a bunch of Phase 4 that I have really, really liked. I loved Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
I liked Hawkeye. I liked Loki. I loved Moon Knight. Loved all those.
Shang-Chi is great.
Shang-Chi is great. Also kind of looked like crap, but at least had Tony Leung. He doesn't look like crap. He looks great. You know,
and there are sequences of that movie that look great. You know, there's stuff at the end that look bad.
Absolutely.
But there lots of stuff in the first 2/3 of that movie look great because, you know, all the stuff on that bus, they built like a cool big practical bus set to do that fight. They did the fucking work on that one.
Absolutely. There's lots of good choreography. The beginning of the like fight in the garden, all of that. Yeah. There's been a lot of bad Phase 4 stuff, like Falcon and the Winter Soldier and What If and stuff like that. But, and forgettable, like Black Widow, or offensively long, like Eternals.
Those two I have not seen. Like, I have not gone to see Black Widow or Eternals, even though I do still have like a week or two left of Disney Plus.
Well, there you go. Maybe watch Black Widow if you liked Florence Pugh in Hawkeye. Is my recommendation. She's the best part of it.
She was good in Hawkeye, but it's like
she's
not.
The only...
It's hard to build up the momentum to sit down to be like, well, I could play more Resident Evil, or I could watch more Kaguya-sama, or I could do this, that, or the other thing, or I could watch this sort of middling superhero movie. Just to have watched it would be the only reason to be like, well, I've seen 27 of the 29 Marvel films. Why not make it 28 of the 29 would be the only reason.
But what's going on, though, is that even though Phase 4 has not been a disaster, there's been good stuff, it feels so exhausting because there's so much they're making. It's like aggressively interconnected in various ways, and some of it isn't. Moon Knight, luckily, was disconnected, and I like that about it. But, like, it's not going anywhere. People have been talking about this. There's no Thanos on the horizon. There's no bigger story being told. And it just feels like the content mill churning because it needs to churn, not because there's a bunch of fun ideas for movies they're having. And that's what feels so exhausting as someone who has been watching these since the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is that thing of where they are running into the same exact kinds of issues that the superhero comic books run into at a certain point where, like, you're having to mine these characters and do the big, like, events or references to other characters to try to, like, keep the plates spinning and keep the game up. And it ends up sort of consuming more of your material than anything else, and so it ends up at like the cost of actually just getting really strong creative figures that have a like interesting idea and a clear story to tell with the character, and just letting them do that. Then you end up in a, like, we're not yet at like the, every 6 months we have to have a world-ending massive superhero comic book crossover thing that kills off 5 characters that will come back in 2 more months, and it will reset the continuity, but didn't reset the continuity because actually it's just a parallel universe. Like, we haven't gotten to that level of fucked up, but like, if the MCU doesn't stop, we will eventually get there. We will eventually get to the point where the MCU will reset its continuity in some big Crisis on Infinite Earths, which I know that's DC, but that esque kind of event, or like Ultimatum, which they did with the Ultimate Universe, and like in the universe, but then then tease at the end that like, oh, now this is like a new version of Iron Man or whatever. But then eventually they'll have Robert Downey Jr. do a cameo of fucking this universe's Iron Man from hell or something, and create a seed that regenerates the old MCU continuity. It's like, eventually on this path we will be there. We will be in the hell of American superhero comic books, but it will just be a movie form. And I'm both like morbidly excited for like that to go that far, and I'm also like dreading like, when it gets to that point, I wouldn't be watching these movies anymore, in the same way that I don't really read superhero comic books, but I read like about them because I'm curious about them, but don't actually want to read all the bad stuff. I'll just occasionally pick up, oh, this Spider-Man run good, I'll read some of this. Is this Batman thing good? I'll read some of that. And that's how I do superhero comic books. But I don't actually like keep up with it because it's not worth keeping up with.
And I'll say, if it weren't for this podcast, there's a lot of Marvel stuff at this point I wouldn't have watched. Like, there's a lot of, like, the podcast is what's kept me coming to a lot of these. This one I would have gone and seen because I loved Ragnarok. Yes. And that's why this one is especially disappointing. But I really had the feeling with Love and Thunder, more than with any other Marvel thing, of, like, they need to stop for a year or two and figure out what they're doing. Because this is not... Because as you say, it's almost like no one is going to decide to do the Crisis on Infinite Earths thing. It's just that they're going to have nowhere else to go.
Yes.
If they don't stop and reconvene. I think Kevin Feige has been very effective. I also think this is too much for any one producer to handle at a consistent quality, And part of that is the visual effects. We went from having 2 to 3 Marvel movies a year up to and including Endgame. And then after Endgame, they just exploded. And now it is minimum 3 to 4 movies a year, plus 3 to 5 Disney Plus shows a year, which are all 3 times as long as a movie. Did the number... So we there were 4 times as much Marvel stuff per year. Do we suddenly have 4 times as many visual effects artists? No. So the quality of it all just gets halved or quartered or something, because that's what has to happen to ration the amount of work. And it's becoming problematic in a lot of ways. And at the point where, your new Thor movie is getting impacted by it, I'm just sad about it,
Yeah, it just feels like it has gotten so big that it's eating itself up in all these ways. And it's a thing of where I think the MCU is very clearly in the state now where, like, I'm going to say for you, Jonathan, do not go watch an MCU thing just to have seen it for the podcast. It's like, this is we are past the point where that is like a thing to do. It's like, I think we're very much at the point with the MCU where, like, the only rational way to approach it is to look at individual projects and determine, is like, does this sound like a thing I want to watch? Like Moon Knight, I was excited to watch because I like Moon Knight as a character. I liked the trailers. I like Oscar Isaac. I was like excited about that project, and then when I actually watched it, I really enjoyed it. But it's like, I went in with like an excitement for Moon Knight because I liked Moon Knight and I liked what they were doing with it, and the show actually kind of lived up to what my hopes were for it. But like, my hopes for like watching Black Widow are so low. Like, I feel like I've seen that movie without having seen that movie. It's just like, why bother seeing it? And I think that's just where like people need to be with the MCU. That if like your compulsion is to watch everything because of the interlocking continuity, well, it turns out the interlocking continuity is fucking horseshit, and it sucks, and like it doesn't lead into anything very big or meaningful. And especially when they don't have like a Thanos-esque sort of target to be working towards, there's really no reason to be watching things for the continuity, because it's like, well, there's no, maybe someday some minor detail presented in Eternals will end up being relevant. But since Eternals is like, the bastard stepchild of the Marvel movies, feels like nobody really likes it, nobody wants to talk about it, they're not going to pick up anything from that movie to be really important later on, because they're going to pick oh, what was people liked Shang-Chi. You know, like we'll pick shit that we set up in those kinds of in the projects that people are enjoying, and we'll pick up on those, not the stuff that like everyone hated.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the thing that is the other frustrating thing is that in a time when they could have relaxed the interconnections
Yes.
and just kind of gone for, we're going to make a lot of stuff, you don't have to watch all of it, pick what you like. They've gone for more and more and more and more interconnections, and that's where it gets annoying. Like, if you want to watch The Marvels, which is the Captain Marvel sequel, you will need to have seen Captain Marvel, WandaVision, where we get the other Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel, and all of that is going to be what the Marvels movie is a sequel to. You know, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, I loved. There's a lot of Marvel you have to know going into that movie to not necessarily understand everything, but like to see what they're playing with.
Or the thing you have to just also accept is like you just don't have to know it. Like that's the thing where
fine,
like
yeah.
if you that's like the person who reads superhero comic books saying of like you can't. Like in that
Right.
world, you can't, because either you have
Exactly.
infinite time, that's the only thing you do, and you've got a lot of money on your hands, or you just say, I have got to let go of wanting to be able to know when there's a little yellow box from the editor in the corner that says, like the star that says, for more info on this, see Batman number 1286. It's like, Batman, what? Like, I'm reading fucking, it's like, sometimes it feels like you're reading, you know, a fucking Spider-Man comic and they've just pointed you to like a Superman thing or some shit. It's like, what the fuck is even happening? And you just have to let go of that shit.
Going back to our Kazuki Takahashi discussion, this is why I've always loved manga.
Yes.
Because you never get that in manga.
Yes.
Manga is just, I'm reading Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm reading Yu-Gi-Oh! It will never tell me to go read something else.
It is one of the many reasons why manga is way better than American comic books, is because they never got on that shit.
Yeah, also more successful.
Yeah.
Like, that's part of like why manga like is just a bigger publishing industry, is that it's much more welcoming to people than the intricacies of comic books in America. Anyway, getting off track a little bit, it's a weird place Marvel is in. We've been saying that for a while. You know, we'll see where we go from here. We've got the Black Panther sequel. I'm worried about that one for a number of reasons, but we'll see. That's the last movie this year. We've got She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, coming out. That one looks like it's got great visual effects, Sean.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least they're doing She-Hulk's actual character design. You know, I like. They feels like the heart is in the right place with that. That trailer was a little funky, but
I liked the trailer, other than that it looked like shit.
Yes.
Like, I think the actual pitch for the show is fun. Yeah. Anyway,
I would
we'll
love
see.
to live in the alternate universe just to see, because I'm not even sure if it would actually even look better. But the like Lou Ferrigno version of it, where you just give her like fucking, you just put green makeup on her and she's like, it's good enough. I don't know if
I think that would
actually sell the effect better or not, but
I think it would look better than what they have right now. I think if you think about like all of the face paint stuff done in Guardians of the Galaxy looks so good. And if you're able to do some good trick photography to make her look big, like, this is not a problem that people have not surmounted before, is my point. So, and it wouldn't have, because the Lou Ferrigno thing is like cheap weekly TV stuff. You can work harder on it now. So anyway, we'll talk about all that in the future. Maybe not.
Maybe
next week.
I think the thing we need to definitively say is like, there's no promise that we are guaranteed to cover like Marvel stuff. I think like
we've missed stuff already.
We've already missed stuff, but I just like want to make it very clear that like that has ended of like, and we do podcasts on every single Marvel thing, and it is only for the stuff that we both watch that we're like interested in. It's not going to be like with Thor: Love and Thunder. We both watched this movie because we wanted to, and unfortunately, it was a bad movie. But yeah, like it is.
One other thing I wanted to say about Thor. I'm looking at the box office numbers now because it's Sunday and we have the estimates in.
Mm-hmm.
The weekend estimate for Thor: Love and Thunder is 143 million. That is number one. That is a big opening. I will say, I think that is the first, like, maybe hard sign of MCU fatigue we've seen at the box office, because that's not that much, frankly, for the new Thor. Ragnarok opened to 122 million 5 years ago. And that was a huge jump. Like, that was double like what the Dark World opened to. This is slightly higher, and with inflation and everything, not that much higher in real world dollars than Ragnarok's opening. This one had a bigger push behind it. It's a summer window, which usually would be higher box office. Ragnarok was a November opening. And compare this to Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange opened to 187 million. This opened way lower than Doctor Strange 2. That to me says that the reviews got to people and that maybe there's just a little, movie didn't flop. They're not going to lose. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I think people have been waiting. When do we see a little bit of box office fatigue? That to me looks like a little bit of box office fatigue.
Yeah, I would not be confident in assigning anything to box office fatigue because it's like I think it's I'm like committed to. I think that it will never end. Like I don't think
I'm not saying it will end, but this has been. This is something we haven't talked about on the show. The American box office has been on fire this year. Like, movies have done really well. Doctor Strange did way ahead of expectations. Top Gun Maverick has been like a crazy success story. One of the biggest domestic successes in the history of movies. Minions was huge last week and did a really good hold this week. Like, everything has done pretty well. And this is kind of middle of the pack for what I think analysts were predicting was going to be much bigger. So
yeah,
you know.
but I would just like personally assign it more to. I think the word of mouth for this movie is extremely tepid. And I would assign more to that than like Marvel fatigue.
But tepid word of mouth hasn't always hurt. It hurt it for Eternals because Eternals was just like not tepid. It was like noxious word of mouth. But, like, you know, Marvel has overcome tepid word of mouth before. This is a little different.
It might be Marvel fatigue or, you know, but, like, again, I just think, like, be ready for, like, you know, the next 50 years of Marvel Studios films. You know, it's like, it's the Marvel fatigue I'm not convinced that it's ever really going to happen. In the same way that, like, in video games, people always are like, oh, have we reached open world fatigue? Is a thing I've heard people say since, like, 2005 or some shit with Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. It's like, no, it turns out people like open world video games and they'll keep on making them and people will keep on buying them. And I think Marvel is in the same situation of like, it's just going to keep on happening.
Yeah. Well, next week on the show, we'll be doing a Weekly Suit Gundam where we review Mobile Suit Gundam Kukuru's Doan's Island.
Yes.
New movie. That's going to be exciting.
I have not watched it yet because I've been waiting for this podcast.
Oh, I'm so excited, Sean. It's going to be a fun one. In 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a Resident Evil 4 retrospective episode. I think that's going to be a ton of fun.
Resident Evil 4.
And then at the end of the month, we're going to be launching a new podcast called Japanimation Station. It's going to be a blast.
Yeah, so a lot of exciting stuff in the future for the podcast. So, you know, Thor was disappointment, but our podcast will not be.